And in terms of apologies, we have 3 recorded apologies so far from Phil Flanagan, Sandra O'Brien and Megan Fearon, who are in Edinburgh attending a Northern Ireland Assembly Business Trust educational visit. So, I don't know if there's any other apologies or not. Maybe people have been delayed slightly in the traffic, a bit like myself earlier.
Paul's due. Paul and Sammy will be late.
All right, but they're coming anyway.
Yeah.
That's all right. Right. Can we move then to the draft minutes? That's at page 4. Are members content with the accuracy and detail of the minutes? Agreed?
Great.
Yeah. Okay. Chairperson's business then. There's a 2014 survey of services. Members will be aware that the 2014 survey of services is now underway, and it's important that all members and their staff reflect the services provided by the Assembly Commission and respond to the survey. The closing date for the survey is Friday the 6th of June. I'm not entirely aware of what services they're talking about, but anyway. Then, utility regulator consultation on the possible cancellation of generating unit agreements in Northern Ireland. I met with PowerNI on Tuesday past regarding the utility regulator consultation on the possible cancellation of generating unit agreements in Northern Ireland, and tabled is information provided by PowerNI.
Sorry about that.
There we are, Sydney. Tabled is information provided by PowerNI. So it would appear on the face of it anyway that there were certain factual aspects of the utility regulator submission that were called into question by NIE. So if members are content to address this matter when the utility regulator briefs the committee on the 3rd of July. Read. Okay. Now, Special Advisor on Economic Policy. Just to remind members that we agreed that the Deputy Chair and the Clerk would attend a knowledge exchange seminar in the Long Gallery on Thursday the 15th of May, at which Dr. Budd was presenting. To inform members, the Deputy Chair and the Clerk attended the session, which was on sustainable economy, and Dr. Budd presented on the Can the Peace Dividend Devolution Transform Business in Northern Ireland, listed on the UK fastest growing sub-region. Now, table is information on Dr. Budd provided by Assembly Research. And now, Jim, perhaps you were in attendance at that. Phil's away, so he can't comment on what was or wasn't said there. But you attended that event, just with your views to, how shall we put it, the capacity of Dr. Budd to advise the committee.
Yeah, well, the Deputy Chair agreed that it would be appropriate and somebody the committee could work with. Absolutely.
Right. So, on that basis, then, are we content to proceed with the proposal?
Sorry, Mr. Quorum, Chair.
We've lost our will not be agreed to say anything or to do anything. We'll just wait till the Sydney come.
Suspend the meeting. Suspend the meeting.
We'll just suspend the meeting. Sydney.
Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Committee Room.
We're back again. We were dealing with the issue of the Special Advisor on Economic Policy. So to ask if members are content to proceed with the proposal to seek the appointment of Dr. Budd as Specialist Advisor to the committee.
Sorry, Chair, is that table? No.
No, I don't think so.
Chair, the information is tabled, but it's the information from the Assembly research paper that has come to committee previously.
Okay.
It's just
Right.
a reminder.
Okay.
Agreed then?
Agreed.
Thank you. Now, and I don't know whether they're there yet or not. We're moving to the oral briefing from SSE. Okay. I'll take a cup of coffee here, Jeff.
They're the generators. I thought it over, you see. Hey, we always do. Right? Nice tile, you're all right.
Morning.
Okay.
Sorry, we go through staff.
Right.
Been here before.
Been here before. Without the flu, didn't
Right.
I?
Today we have the oral briefing from SSE, the Electricity Policy Review, Part 3. That's grid connections. And to remind members and members of the public that items of business will be covered by Hansard, so electronic devices, with the exception of assembly tablets, should be switched off as they can interfere with the recording system. So papers for this item are at page 11 and include the clerk's brief, which is page 12, the SSE briefing at page 14. And today with us is Mr. David Manning, Director of Corporate Affairs. And sorry, you have two colleagues with you that I wasn't notified of here. So, and Mr. Ian Wright, Head of Regulation, and Bernice Doyle, Grid Manager. You're very welcome, and thank you for attending and presenting to the committee today. Probably you're aware you've gone through this before. So, the nature of it is you have up to 10 minutes to make a presentation to members, and then we have a Q&A session. So thanks again for coming to be with us here today. And if it's yourself that's fronting here, Mr. Manning, please continue.
Okay, thank you very much. You have a very short 2 slides handed to you there, which I'll refer to them as I go. I'm going to try and speak for as brief a period as possible, so we'll certainly keep it under the 10 minutes. So, SSE Electricity operates as an electricity generator, an electricity and gas supplier, and a provider of energy services in Northern Ireland. Entering the market in 2008, SSE has invested around £500 million into the future of Northern Irish energy. Today, we have over 1,500 megawatts of generation capacity participating in the single electricity market, including renewables, gas and oil. Of this, we operate around 125 megawatts of renewable generation capacity installed here in NI. Meanwhile, we have over 300,000 gas and electricity customers here. Thanks to our product offerings, customers who have switched to SSE Electricity have saved a total of £17 million in recent years. As a generator and supplier of electricity, the network is essential to us for the transport of power from generation sources to customers' homes and businesses. The adequacy, cost-effectiveness, timely delivery and maintenance of the network is therefore crucial to our business, and it is also important to the communities that we serve. Let us take, for example, our recently completed investment, the 73 megawatt Slieve Kirk Wind Park, about which we have included a slide in your pack. Of this 125 million investment, 36 million was spent on goods and services from 75 local businesses. This project will also contribute a further 18.5 million to the local community through commercial rates, landowner leases and community funding. This is a total investment in a rural area in Derry, Londonderry, of £55 million. The timely delivery of the grid connection was a key enabler of this project. Without it, this local investment and its resulting local economic benefit would not have materialised. In the remaining few minutes, I would like to address 4 priorities as we see them regarding the electricity network in NI. With regard to planning permission and the issue of a connection offer, SSE notes that a connection application will not be processed until planning permission has been granted. We agree with this policy as it prevents the hoarding of grid by projects which may ultimately not be developed. The gate process in ROI has had problems in this respect. Meanwhile, we anxiously await the full implementation of the Planning Act, in particular the provision of timelines for submissions by statutory consultees, which will make for a more efficient decision-making process. With regard to connection offers, we are satisfied that these are issued relatively promptly once planning permission has been granted. However, we have found that delays in the actual delivery of the connection infrastructure are unacceptably long. SSE has experienced delays in over 5 years in the delivery of connections. To illustrate this point, we have included in your slide pack again the timeline experience for our Slieve Davina 2 wind farm. As you will note, the planned connection date has been a continuously movable feast and remains uncertain. We would highlight that this level of delay and uncertainty is a real barrier to investment and damages Northern Ireland's attractiveness as an investment location. This is particularly the case for SSE, as projects must compete internally for funding. It is most disheartening to lose funding for better projects here in NI to other jurisdictions due to something as obvious as a reliable timeline. Our second point relates to contestability of grid connections. Northern Ireland operates a shallow connection charging regime. This means that developers must pay for the local wires that are required to connect a generation project to the wider grid system. Currently, generators in Northern Ireland must engage and pay NIE to construct these shallow connection assets in accordance with the rates and procedures set out by the utility regulator. In other jurisdictions, including ROI and GB, generators have the option to take responsibility for the connection of these shallow connection assets themselves. SSE has found that the contestable delivery of connection offers cost savings of 20 to 40% and reduces delays in connecting projects, often by years. But ultimately, it gives the developer control over the delivery timeframe. We have taken responsibility for connections of many projects, including our Athay and Drogheda wind farms in ROI. We also reached agreement with NIE for the contestable delivery of the Slieve Kirk wind park connection, which I referred to at the start. If we had not done so, the project would not have been built, foregoing the 36 million of local economic benefit illustrated above. Illustrated earlier. We would strongly advocate that contestability be introduced in Northern Ireland for both transmission and distribution connected generators, and we note that the utility regulator's work plan has indicated that it will deliver contestability. However, this has been an objective of the regulator for several years now. We urge the regulator to complete this project as soon as possible, such that developers may progress their projects in a timely and cost-effective manner. Our third point centres on progress to develop connection clusters. SSE welcomes that cluster policy introduced by the utility regulator, under which adjacent projects can share transmission and distribution infrastructure. This is an effective way to reduce the cost and environmental impact of that infrastructure. However, SSE has experienced substantial delays in cluster connections being delivered as a consequence of the regulator's policy requiring funding approval at a number of different stages of development. Our issue is not the approvals themselves, rather it's the absence of a defined timeline for decision-making at each of these stages. A more defined decision-making timeline will therefore enable developers to move ahead and construct projects in a more predictable manner. Furthermore, we submit that allowing contestable construction of cluster connections delivers on the objective to protect customers from unnecessary cost, as the first developer will carry the entire investment risk of overcapacity should others decide not to develop their projects. Our fourth and final point relates to general network upgrades and the North-South interconnector. SSE highlights that upgrades to the grid are necessary and that there is a general need to maintain and expand capacity to allow the single electricity market to operate as intended and therefore deliver the most cost-efficient dispatch of generation plant on the wider system for the customer's benefit. Of particular importance is the continued delay in the construction of the North-South interconnector, which, as stated by the regulator, costs customers on the island over 16 million per annum, almost 100 million since the single electricity market commenced operation in 2007. And we note the committee's comments on this in earlier reports. In these opening remarks, I sought to highlight to the committee a number of priorities as perceived by SSE Electricity, including the economic benefit of energy infrastructure to rural communities, the consequence of delays in grid connections, the necessity of contestability and clustering, and lastly, the importance of key infrastructure delivery, such as the North-South interconnector. Delays associated with the delivery of connections make it difficult to make investment decisions. Delays increase costs and undermine the investment case for projects that deliver tangible economic and employment benefits, as we illustrated with our Slieve Kirk example. Therefore, greater investment certainty is required. This can best be achieved through the delivery of a contestable connection framework. Ultimately, the focus must centre on delivering for customers. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much indeed for that. Back to the whole question of contestability, and I heard you saying there about the issue of Slieve Kirk, or had you not arrived at an accommodation with NIE, that just simply wouldn't have been delivered. You just, if you like, expand on that a wee bit further, because this is an issue that has cropped up time after time with us, that is delays in connections, the whole issue of projected costs and the likes of that, but certainly even the evaluation of a site or of a proposal by NIE, that's very, very slow. And even if we could take it to the stage of what would your views be, and I know you're working in both parts of the island, your views be on just completely opening up the market to other firms, just not NIE, providing the connections, because clearly if they can't do it within a time that is efficient for a company or for an individual turbine developer, that there has to be other options looked at. So what are your views on that? And just if you could expand a wee bit further on the Slieve Kirk proposal, how that worked for you. In other words, were you hitting a problem, and then you had to go to NIE and say, look guys, we have a problem here. This proposal will not go ahead unless we move to another method of doing this. If you could just talk me through that whole process, how it worked, and maybe even the length of time that took, because I'm sure if the first bit was being slow, then the second bit might have been a degree of less slow.
Well, just to talk you through the background on the Slieve Kirk one, basically we had a large project which we sought to connect to the transmission system. So previously all projects would have been connected to the distribution system. And in talks with NIE, the NIE sought to build a cluster substation, or a substation that would accommodate more than simply our project. We then foresaw that if we were to go through the standard kind of process, at that stage the charging statement and cluster approvals hadn't come out of determination yet from the regulator. And so we had other projects such as Slieve Davina 2 where we could see this, extended timeline for delivery that had little certainty around it. We needed to bring certainty into it, and we were in a position to build out the assets ourselves, so we put this proposal to them so that we could take control over the delivery timeline. Now, we got agreement from NIE to build a line from the cluster substation, which is called Killymallock, back out to the local wind farm substation and some equipment at the wind farm substation. NIE still built the cluster substation, but we 100% funded it. So that was our way around this whole delay in terms of the funding approvals that would be required.
Sorry, so you 100% funded a cluster substation that they were projecting to do anyway, but they were saying it will be a while before we do it, but if you want to do it for us, that's grand. Was that their approach?
Yeah, we knew that there would be delays involved in, similar to all the other proposals for a cluster substation. We could see that as well, so our remit was to try and bring control over that timeline for delivery, and so we offered to take on the risk in terms of funding that substation build, on an understanding that as further projects were connected into it, we would be rebated.
Well, that's what I was actually going to ask you. You were funding. You put up the money up front for get a substation built efficiently that ultimately was going to benefit others. So part of that agreement was that you would get a rebate back from that as and when others came on.
Yes.
Yep.
Right. Hi, there you go. That sounds an unusual way of doing things. It sounds a bit of a convoluted way of doing things, to my mind, anyway. But can you explain to me? Obviously, you as a company, you're sharp business people. You can see when some things aren't being done. At what point did you decide? In other words, how long did it take you from application point to determination point when you decided, look, this is seriously not going to work if we depend upon NIE delivering the substation? We have to put, if you like, a counter proposal to them. And how long did it take from I'm asking two questions here. How long did it take from you put your initial proposal to them till they came back to say, look, new substation required here, and they told you it's going to take us X months or X years before we deliver that? And at that point, how long was it before you went back to them and said, look, we have a counter proposal here which will solve matters for us? And then how long did it take them to come back and agree to that? Okay. I'm trying to get in my mind a time frame of roughly, it'll not be exact within a day or two, but if maybe you're the people that were dealing with it up front and you'll know exactly what it was.
Right, I'd like to deal with that in two parts. One is the background and the other is the best information we can provide on timeline. The background to this was that our experience in contestable delivery of connections in ROI was such that we thought this was the correct approach to use in Northern Ireland. At the time, there was no obvious statutory prohibition on anyone coming along and building the network. At that time also, there was no statutory requirement for a licensing arrangement for distribution. So what we were trying to do is push the boundary a bit to make sure that we were making use of whatever facilities were available within the framework and the regulatory framework in Northern Ireland to deliver this project efficiently. We did, however, because we were first on this route, make a mistake because the connection voltage turned out to be transmission rather than distribution. But when we started off down the line, we believed it was distribution. We believed there was no statutory...
Sorry, just for those of us who are non-technical, can you explain what the ramifications of that is, please, just?
The law says that any wire which is operated at or above 110 kilovolts is transmission.
All right.
And with the European third package, there are restrictions on owning generation and transmission. So there was this complication we hadn't originally appreciated. In order to build a connection, we wanted to build an overhead line. For that, we required an Article 40 consent, which is issued by DETI. And there was an element of time spent working out with DETI whether or not it was within their power to grant us this, and in the end they did. So the background to the connection was that we were trying to do it entirely ourselves for the reasons of efficiency that my colleagues...
Sorry, how long did the DETI bit take then? I'm trying to get a bit of a handle...
My recollection is it took 9 or 10 months.
Right.
But part of that was in investigating whether they actually had the power to do it or not, because nobody had ever done this before apart from NIE.
Okay. Now, was that running parallel to your proposal being put to NIE, or was it in tandem to it?
Because we had intended to do this ourselves, the bringing NIE into the picture happened slightly later, because all the time we were expecting to do it ourselves. Obviously, the connection application within. So the whole process of the contestable delivery evolved rather than being deliberately planned at the outset.
Well, I'm sort of still trying to get the time frame on from project to going to NIE and saying, look, this is what we need. And then NIE, obviously, at that point, came back and said, look, we need substation. And then at that point, you saying, well, okay, let's look at this. And then you went back to them with the proposal for delivery of the substation by yourselves, to a point where, yes, you've arrived at that. I'm trying to get a handle as to the time frame for all of this just as a company, because you've raised it as an issue of efficiency, you know.
And I understand the question that's been asked. I suppose because we were breaking new ground, it had never been done before. So in terms of, so this timeline will always have looked a little bit, at this point in time, it will look like it would have taken a good few months to get there, but that would be a function of breaking new ground and everybody getting comfortable with this was something that could be done. But I think your question is you get an offer and then you decide you're going to do it contestably, and then and when did you go out and do it, and how much faster did that make it?
If you don't have the details with you today, you can submit them to us in writing. Sure. It's just, I want to get then clear for the committee, just the issue of efficiency of delivery of these. You referred to it yourself, connections, and what you had to do, which was probably in that instance somewhat unique. And if we could get a handle on that, and then if we move on to the other part of my questioning, which was around the whole issue of actual delivery, the contestability issue, or indeed should that all be just opened up, and if NIE isn't or hasn't got the capacity, and they're even they've had some job layoffs yesterday, if they haven't the capacity to do that, do we move to the point of where do we involve other private companies, because we're hearing in previous evidence that in parts of Britain that actually happens, where private companies just come in, do the work, that's it, done and dusted. So I'm asking for an opinion on that, if you would venture it, just as to how you might see that operating. And maybe, I don't know, maybe some of you have had experience of how it works over in parts of Britain.
I think just referring back to the first part, what might be useful is, because Slieve Kirk was breaking new ground, it might be useful to look at other wind farms that we've delivered contestably from the point that the offer comes to the point then we move forward. So that'll give you a clear sense in an efficiently operating contestable environment. This is how it changes the delivery time frame. So we'll come back to you on that one if that's okay.
That's grand, thank you.
Well, I can talk through one of the ROI examples, if that's helpful. I mean, so what would happen in ROI would be that you would make an application and for a connection, and you would be given a connection offer.
Right, this is to ESB?
If to ESB Networks or EirGrid, they would give you an offer. And in the offer, they would identify the portions which are contestable and non-contestable.
Right.
And you then have a window to elect to contest some portion of the contestable works.
Right.
Now, that window is open from the time you sign your offer, once you have a signed connection agreement, up until the point where the system operator goes into a detailed design. So once they really start engaging in delivering your grid infrastructure, your window kind of closes at that stage.
Now, can I ask just the contestability bit?
Yeah.
Is that determined in statute, by law, or is that, or by the regulator, whatever, or is that just left to the company to say, well, we'll allow you to have this bit contestability, and we'll not worry about the other bits and pieces?
The background to that comes through the RES directive and to the IME directive 96/92 before that, which both of the 2001 and the 2009 directives say that member states may allow producers of electricity from renewable energy sources wishing to be connected to the grid to issue a call for tender for the connection work. So that the background is in European directives. In Ireland, the statutory route has been followed, and the first approach to that was in SI 445 of 2000, where the Electricity Regulation Act was amended to allow transmission-connected generators to undertake contestable works.
Wow.
And then SI 226 of 2009 gave generators the right to construct part of the connection to the distribution system. In GB, they've gone down a different route because there isn't the same statutory backing for it. However, Ofgem has taken the view that facilitating competition is the basis on which they want to promote contestability. And their website has a couple of comments, which I'll read with your permission.
Sure.
One of which is, we are committed to promoting competition within the energy markets as a mechanism to benefit consumers through increased quality or decreased prices or both. Natural monopolies inevitably make it more difficult to promote competition. The installation of new connection assets helps to minimise natural monopolies through the creation of an element of competition. And then it goes on to talk about independent connection providers and independent network operators. So this is the underlying philosophy that Ofgem bring to contestability, and they have incorporated conditions in the network operators' licences that require them to separate contestable and non-contestable aspects.
Right.
So you can have it through statute or through general competition.
Just sort of bear with me, I'm sort of on a bit of a roll here with this. That EU directive, is its applicability subject to interpretation by each member state, or each, in our case, each region?
Yes, it is. The contestability bit is member states may. So
it's not
up to-
shall?
No.
Okay. Now, then, leading on from that, the Ofgem bit, which seems to me perfectly sensible, why wouldn't that be applicable, or as applicable here in Northern Ireland then?
I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be equally
Right.
applicable.
So that brings me on to the next question. And in the South, or in GB, can a single developer employ the resources of a private firm just to do the connection bit?
Yes, that's
Yes.
what we do.
That's what you do.
Yeah, we basically...
It's not yourselves, you just bring in a contractor to do it for you.
Yeah, so the way the process works is that once we elect to contest the connection works, we get detailed technical specifications from ESB Networks ultimately, and that tells us exactly what they require us to build. And then we go out to tender to a private contractor, and we manage the delivery of those works. Now, the delivery is overseen in terms of there would be site visits and regular meetings with ESB Networks and EirGrid to ensure that what we're delivering is up to their standards. And then at the end of that, there's a handover process where the asset is transferred back to ESB Networks.
Of course, the big question for us is, why isn't that being done here? Because the complaint we regularly have, I'm not asking for an answer in this, the complaint we regularly have is about slowness in connections, and we're saying done down south, done over the water. Just simply, why isn't it being done here? So
I think what we've seen, Chairman, is that the Slieve Kirk proved an excellent case study in terms of how it can be done well. All of the relevant information associated with it has been provided to the utility regulator. The utility regulator in the work plan has committed to delivering contestability, and I made one or two points in my earlier remarks about timelines. So it's just being a little bit more. So it's been said it will be delivered. Now it's just a case of moving on and delivering it.
One final question. You're aware of the RP5 and the Commissioner's decision there. In terms of, and you're obviously watching this, you're astutely involved in the industry, and the terms of the licence then, in terms of what was being determined by RP5, from what you've read from what the utility regulator is proposing, can that contestability or changes to it be introduced within the current phase of the licence, current term of the licence?
I wouldn't see any reason why not.
Yes.
The utility regulator did start off the process at the end of 2010 when they pointed out in a consultation on the whole connection regime. They said that there are currently no formal mechanisms in place to allow generators to tender openly for the construction of these works. And in their next steps paper, which looked at comments coming back from interested market people, They said it's proposed the utility regulator will investigate further the introduction of contestability for connections, and the programme of work will run in parallel with the RP5 programme.
Right.
So we have provided to the utility regulator the background documentation for our connection at Slievekirk and how the process worked. But there isn't a formal process in place yet, and that would obviously have to be agreed to allow it to be done in a methodical manner.
Okay, thanks very much. That's been very helpful. Mr. Dunn, Gordon.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks very much, folks, for coming in this morning.
Very interesting.
The issue of the delays in connection by NIE is an issue that we have looked at considerably. And how do you think NIE, what can they do to improve their processes and systems to try and reduce this significantly? It's an ongoing problem. The chair has already touched on some of it, but what more can be done? You've given an example here, if I've read it correctly, of the Slieve to Vinna connection. Yeah. Is that 5 years, really?
Yeah.
It pushed that out 5 years on you.
And the current date is based on assumptions for approvals for funding, which again, there's no defined timelines, so that could certainly move again.
And the point has been made here that the level of delay is a real barrier to investment and damages Northern Ireland's attractiveness as an investment location. I think that is the case. These sort of delays have a knock-on effect. Does NIE need to get smarter in relation to how they manage these processes? I suppose is the bottom line in relation to my first question.
Okay, I'm happy to take that one. I think ultimately what we've come in the conversation we've had so far, the role that contestability can play can be very important in allowing timelines to be achieved. And I think by having contestability there, it provides an incentive to everybody to perform to those timelines. With regard to the second question, which is around the loss of investment, if I have a development that I want to deliver here in Northern Ireland and I have my competing colleague over in Scotland who similarly wants to attract SSE funds, if I say the timeline is X, but they look at me and they say, but we don't really have certainty on that because we saw what happened with Slieve to Vinna, then I lose that capital investment to the other competing bidder within my own company. So I would, for the three of us here at this table, a large part of our job is attracting SSE's capital investment here to Northern Ireland. So we would like to see those timelines to be a lot more stable so that our company can have confidence in what we say to them and they will want to spend their money here in Northern Ireland.
Okay. So there's a real issue that needs addressed. Is it? You feel it's a matter of, in many ways, resources from NIE? Is there a lack of resources? Is there a lack of commitment to running this section, to dealing with it?
Well, I don't think it would be appropriate for me to comment on that. In the same, a business,
are there issues
a business
there
can only comment on its own.
Are those issues that you're aware of? Is there a complaint we can't manage? We haven't got the resources to do what you want on time. Is this part of the problem?
No, it's not something that we've had directly highlighted to us in our dealings with NIE.
Right.
But again, as David's saying, I think that above all, we value certainty. If you have certainty, you can plan, even if it's certainty for a longer period for decision making than we would like. At least you can plan for that. But the real issue for us at the moment is we just have no certainty. So this thing of having to get multiple stages of approval, but each of those stages has a high level of uncertainty. That is really, for us, that's the nub of the problem, because we cannot plan for when we'll have a decision.
It's analogous to the planning system.
Pardon?
It's analogous to the planning system.
Yeah.
In the planning system, you put in your planning application, it then goes to statutory consultees, but there's no defined timeline for statutory consultees to reply on that. Now, that's coming in the first quarter of next year through the Planning Act, and that's a very welcome piece. But if there's no defined cut-off date by which time you have to respond, then things just get lost in the ether.
So this project, the Vinna, you got your planning in 2007, and your timeline now is run out to 17. 10 years. And prior to those 10 years, you processed the application?
Yes.
You're out to 13 years of it.
So that is a particularly good example of why it becomes difficult to talk to our financial people and
A
say
lot
we'd
has
like to
happened,
make
isn't
this
it?
investment. A lot happens. A lot happens in a week. A lot happens in 10 years.
Well, yes, I think we made the point. It needs to get a lot smarter, the whole thing, really, and more realistic. I've been involved in other engineering projects, my previous job, and the lead-in times are incredible in some things. They just, for various reasons, have to be, but this here, you're talking 13, 14 years. The requirement changes, things change so much. Look at the way the economy has changed here, and it's changing back, we hope. So, you make the point, I think we certainly will need to put pressure on. The planning permission bit, we've had evidence from various groups, and there is a strong argument that the planning and the NIE bit of it should be run in parallel. Now, you're not sure on that. Is there not an argument maybe for smaller systems that they should be?
What we have seen, the best way is to give the example of what has happened in ROI. In the gate process, grid connection offers were given in the absence of planning. And as a consequence of that, would-be developers were in possession of the grid connection offer, but then may never have got planning, and the project never goes anywhere.
Was there no
There's a huge
timeline?
amount of uncertainty.
Sorry, was there no timeline on those grid connection offers?
Once you pay a deposit, you might want to correct me on this as we go along. Once we pay a deposit, once a developer pays a deposit, then they have rights to that grid connection offer.
Secured for them?
Exactly. Now, what our experience has been then is that some developers then have taken that as an asset and will approach a company like SSE or another larger developer and say, we have a grid connection at this point. Are you interested in buying this from us? Mm-hmm. But I would hold the view that all that does is add unnecessary cost into delivery of infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Because you're adding value. Mm-hmm. It's almost like producing a property bubble around grid connections. Mm-hmm. So in our view here, and I think we can learn lessons from what happened in the south on that, and in the north, I wouldn't like to see, or we would be disinclined to see a situation whereby they would run in parallel. It would be important to retain the current system whereby you would have planning and then you would secure your grid connection.
Okay. The last point just in the NIE just came to mind. What sort of consultation does NIE give to a potential developer without planning permission? Are they willing to engage, give pre-discussions, get involved in genuine pre-discussions and give some indication as to whether planning will be achievable or what is required to achieve planning, etc., or are they wait until
you've got your planning permission and you make your application? Well, certainly you can't enter the formal connection application process. Now, what NIE would always be open to would be sitting down with us and talking about their cluster substation plans. So, if what capacity would be built into those plans, and how much they are seeing currently in the pipeline. So their cluster substations would look at what's in planning or with planning in a specific area and try to build out the grid connection for those in an efficient way.
Yes.
But the other approach that we have taken for some of our projects, because we are in this situation where we're stuck in planning for quite a long time and we can't go into the connection application process, is we have sought to engage NIE to carry out studies for us to try and look at potential connection points and costs, but we have to pay for that because they have to go and undertake quite technical studies in terms of load flows and short circuit analysis to understand exactly what the implications are of us connecting at a certain point. So we have done that for projects with it that are still in planning that we are not in the connection application process. But obviously that costs money and the developer has to be willing to pay for that.
That's what that cost.
Yeah.
It's all cost at risk, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, folks, thanks very much. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. Just picking up on a couple of themes that Gordon was developing there. One was you were talking about the power developer bubble and how, the planning before application and those types of things, how that could contribute to that. Now, a distinction has been made to us about, yes, the huge big wind farms and how you can do that and how that potential could arise. But the other case has been put to us that while that can apply to the huge big developments and farms, wind farms, for individual single turbines, that shouldn't be the case. Do you have an opinion on that?
I think that the principle needs to be that all generators are treated equitably, you know, and I'd be concerned about, you know, an approach that starts to differentiate between different types of generators. And
There is one additional point to add. That it was an interesting statistic that came. If I remember correctly, there's 650 odd,
670 odd.
670 odd single connections, and if you do that at about 250 kilowatt per unit,
It ends up at about 138.
you end up at about 140, let's say 140, 150 megawatts of a connection. When you aggregate all of those single generators, that's quite a substantial.
Yeah.
Substantial amount.
It's presuming that they're all been shored up by one developer or two developers. You know, if your argument is that the competition and somebody can scoop it all onto themselves.
Yeah, no, but the point I'm making is when you think of it in that context and you think of the work that NIE need to do in order to look at load flows,
Yes.
how the network needs to be developed, the type of reinforcement that needs to take place in the network, there's still quite, whether you're a single guy or a large guy, there's still quite a lot of work to be done there.
That brings me nicely on to the next part of the question, and that was BEREG, whenever they were in here with us, they said that they believe developers should have access to NIE's graphical information system so that their own studies and their own conclusions could be done about capacities and those types of things. Now, obviously, I don't know enough about that to even comment on it. That's why I'm going to ask you the question, would you find that of benefit commercially if you had access to that and the relevant data so that you could be, in other words, you could very, very quickly commercially rule out certain locations if those weren't going to be workable if you had access to that data?
I would struggle to see how that would be of a significant benefit in that the analysis that NIE will undertake in order to determine where you can connect, it involves quite technical analysis, with low flow studies, and the expertise involved is not something that is widespread. Like, we would only have one or two consultants that we would use to do that kind of work, So to say that a developer with a small site would be able to take a GIS system and extrapolate from that the impact of their connection and others in their area on the wider system.
No, it wasn't. That wasn't. I don't think the argument they were saying generally.
Okay.
Would that be advantageous to yourselves, say?
I struggle to see how it would, because it's I guess what we do at the moment. What I was saying about we've gone to NIE and engaged them to do a study. So we have said, without their GIS, we have looked at the network and just said, for this site, it looks like, here's 3 potential options that maybe would work for us to connect. And then we go to NIE and ask them to scope out a study to look at those and look at the deeper impacts and the technical analysis on those options. So we would engage NIE to do that for us, but there's not so much we can do ourselves, with that. It doesn't. We can look at it and say these points look like, but in terms of any kind of technical analysis, it's not.
All right. No, that's okay.
I think, Chairman, I think I'd ask the question why. Okay, so you've had a position put to you. We'd like access to this information. I think our question would be why. We see a large volume of information and we're just not quite sure what you do with it. So if there's a rational argument to say it's hugely advantageous, okay, but I don't know, so my question is why.
You already know what it is anyway.
Yeah,
That's whether it's
from our perspective, we wouldn't see.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just had to ask a question.
Yeah.
Mr. Anderson, Sydney.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you everyone for presenting to us this morning. A couple of questions. Can I refer to the time taken for the connection to the grid? Action Renewables have commented on the discrepancy between here in Northern Ireland on the GB with that time that it takes to connect. And one of the things they commented and stated was that they believe NIE do not have the resources to speed this up and give that faster, quicker connection. Do you have a comment on that?
The only comment to make at the risk of repeating is that we've seen the advantage that contestability has brought in that example of Slieve Kirk, and where we've seen it in other jurisdictions. So we would see that that would be a natural next step in order to improve efficiency and delivery of grid connections.
In relation to competition, do you have a comment to make if there's more competition, that maybe there would be a possibility of a better and quicker connection? Is competition an issue?
Well, I mean, the delivery of contestability, as Ian was saying, the Ofgem basis for delivering contestability is to promote competition. It will help to drive down costs and bring. It enables developers to take the risk onto themselves in terms of, you know, delivering the infrastructure at the best market price they can go and find. And we've seen it deliver in our experience in ROI and GB. It delivers those significant savings for us.
If I could just add that in the Utility Regulators 2010 consultation, when they asked the question, I think it was 16 out of 24 respondents to the consultation addressed the issue of contestability, and they all said, without exception, that it was a good idea. And NIE also, in their response, said that they would support a move towards competition in connections. So I think within the community of people who have an interest in this, there's a general acceptance that
there is the need to move towards that.
Is appropriate. And I should, for completeness, point out that in talking to the utility regulator, I understand that they are preparing a consultation on connection policy at present.
Okay, the time taken for grid connection certainly is a big issue, and certainly whatever way we can move it forward with, whether it's going to be competition or otherwise, it certainly is something that is a great requirement and a great need. That's an interesting point. Can I go to, in relation to requirement to connect, is there any reason why developers should not be permitted to generate their own electricity for their own use without being required to connect to the grid and still maintain that right to, say, the connection to the grid for additional electricity?
So just understand the question. So they're generating for their own consumption, not for export to the grid?
Yes. But still have that leeway, if and when required.
I mean, large industrial users quite often would have CHP or other on-site generation, standby generation, but there are technical issues where you're connecting an on-site generator to a wider system because they do interact, and so there are policies, technical standards that are in place that manage that process.
Is that the problems and difficulties, and the other reason that is more or less what you're saying here?
Well, it's not an organisational problem, it's just physics.
Yeah, I would think if you're going to put in a unit to produce for your own consumption, fine. If you're going to put in a unit to produce for your own consumption and potentially export, that has a requirement for upgrade works. So there is a cost associated with that. So I think if you need to be very clear in your own
The initial cost is the leveller here. That is the initial cost. So are you saying it wouldn't be feasible unless you were exporting to the grid?
No, I think you would have to do your own cash flow assessment of if I'm going to put in a unit and I want to export from it, and in order to export from it, I'm going to ask NIE to do certain upgrades, are going to be required to do certain upgrades. You have to factor that into the cash flow of your investment. Because you might have that'll increase the amount of capital investment that's needed at the get-go. But if you're only going to produce for your own consumption to meet, let's say it's to meet 90% of your own need, then don't connect to the grid, and you don't have to worry about that capital cost.
Yeah. But the possibility of it being there due to expansion or whatever later down the line, it'd be a possibility.
But then you need to factor in what that cost is going to be in your initial investment.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Very good.
Mr. McKinney.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your contribution so far. Can I just go back to the delays up to 5 years? And you've talked about it being a barrier to investment. a general jeopardy, if you like, in that sense. Can you quantify for us what that jeopardy is in either projects or millions?
Did you want to? The simplest way that I would put that across is, let's go back to the Slieve Kirk example. At Slieve Kirk, that was 125 million capital investment, of which 36 million of that was invested in 75 local businesses. So if you look and say, okay, had that connection continued to be delayed, we wouldn't have built that wind farm now. That 36 million of investment wouldn't have occurred, and that economic value and job creation in that area wouldn't have occurred. And that community also has the opportunity to look forward to another £18.5 million over the lifetime of that wind farm contributed into the local community. So what is the economic cost? Well, it's the value foregone, and in this case, the total value foregone is 55 million to the local community.
Yes, in the case of
Slieve Kirk, that's just one example.
Yeah. But I suppose what I'm saying is, you're saying had that not happened, then that would be the case.
Yes.
And what I'm saying is, are there other projects that are now delayed? I know that we're talking about Slieve. Davina. Sorry, just get the pronunciation right. I should know because I was born in the neighbouring county, but there we are.
You've been away too long.
But what I'm saying is are there projects other than these that are not now being carried forward as a result of these delays? I suppose the simple.
There are, at the moment, there aren't. Other projects that we have are still in the planning phase, so we don't have, connection agreements. There is another project we have a connection agreement. We're not concerned about the delivery of that because it's beside an existing substation, so it's a different situation. But of the other projects that we have in the portfolio, they're in the planning, due to come out at various stages. We would hope in the near future. But the issue is that we already see that they're tied to NIE cluster substations that don't have approval. So we can already see that they're going to get into the same problem.
The other jeopardy then, of course, attaches to the overall renewable energy target and development. Is this hindering the government targets in relation? Is this hindering the government targets?
It's part of a number of issues that are delaying the delivery of renewables targets. Yes. But I can go back to my example of planning again. Planning is another. The delays in the timeline associated with planning is another issue, and we have said our preference is to see planning, so that you're going to you have decided you're building a wind farm at a particular location, and then you will go to NIE and you'll talk about your grid connection. So I wouldn't be inclined to singularly focus in and say grid is the sole responsible party for Northern Ireland under pressure to meet its 2020 targets. But is Northern Ireland under pressure to meet its 2020 targets? I would say yes.
Yeah. Just go down to one very specific thing now, but it probably applies to more minor projects. But it's in terms of even quotation levels and timescales for NIE. And what are your views on that in terms of 90 days?
Well, we would have a similar situation in ROI, for example, so you'd have a 90-day period. Again, for us, we find that in general we get the offers within that allotted time frame, so that particular timeline has an amount of certainty to it. And again, once there's certainty, we plan for it. So, yes, if we could get 2 weeks, it would be great, but I mean, we get it in 90 days, we plan for that, and generally it comes out the other end. So, that doesn't present us with a particular issue. It's thereafter in getting the timelines for the connection dates is the main issue.
If you have your project timeline, whether it's 90 days or 2 weeks, once you know and it's delivered within the timeline, then you can plan around it. Yeah. It's the certainty argument.
Okay, all right, thank you, Chair.
Okay. Mr. Agnew, Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the comments so far. In terms of grid investment, we've obviously seen the latest Competition Commission outcome. Publicly, there's a lot of focus on short-term costs to consumers, but obviously a lot of this investment is for the long term. Ultimately, we would hope with the benefit to consumers. In general, with the price controls, do you believe enough emphasis is being put on the long-term investment that's required? Is it? Do you believe, for example, the Competitions Commission determination is in any way going to be detrimental to your business?
Rather than look specifically at just what the Competition Commission does, because that's one instant in time,
Sure.
if you like. And one of the responsibilities of regulators is to balance public interest over the long and short term, as you said. But they also have to take account of policy developments. So the regulator has to balance up the need for 40-year investments of very capital-intensive works. When will that actually be required? So that there's the timing issue, there's the how much is the right amount to pay, how much do they need to take account of technology changes, distributed generation rather than centralised generating units. So there's an awful lot of competing issues to balance up, and also our policy developments over time. Also, I think with Ofgem, they've shown that recently been a move towards more incentive-based regulation. So taking that in the round, it's a matter of judgment. It has to be a matter of judgment. And the regulator and the Competition Commission have had access to all the information that can be produced, and they have pored over this and analysed it, and anybody from outside could only say, well, they've made the judgment which is based on their own area of expertise, and we must accept that.
And some might say, and we're going to hear from NIE after yourself, that the determination puts the renewables industry, perhaps not the industry at risk, but the ability of Northern Ireland to meet its targets at risk. What would your response be to that?
Well, one of the statements that the regulator made in 2011 was that they would look at contestability for connections in parallel with the RP5 programme. RP5, I think it's fair to say, took longer than was initially expected. But nevertheless, our experience in Slieve-Kirk has enabled us, and I think NIE, to provide the utility regulator with information on how the process worked, albeit it evolved as it went along. So perhaps the amount of parallel work that was hoped for hasn't arisen, but I believe that now RP5 has been put to bed, so to speak, that the regulator will be able to advance with the contestability and certainly the wider connection policy with a more certain policy framework. So I would expect that within the next few months, perhaps up to a year, that developers will have greater certainty on the extent to which they will be able to deliver their own connections, and as Bernice pointed out, able to take control of their own projects.
In terms of that, one of the issues come up as we've investigated this issue is you know, every investment ultimately ends up with a knock-on cost to the consumer, and questions have been raised whether or not developers should take on more of the burden, which contestability sounds like that may be the case, although I want to be interested to hear how much do you then pass on to the consumer, and certainly, you know, it's been questioned whether or not NIE should themselves take some of it. How do you see the cost of investment being metered out, and as I say, particularly with reference with contestability? You certainly have mentioned taking on more of the risk. Does that ultimately mean taking on more of the cost as well?
I think I'd answer that two ways. Any of us operating in this sector, be it a conventional generation or renewable generator, NIE as the network asset owner, suppliers, our focus is on acting in the interest of the customer. Now, acting in the interest of the customer, as we know in energy policy, has three dimensions to it. It's security of supply, its competitiveness, and affordability is a very significant issue within competitiveness, and its protection of the environment. So there's three interesting, challenging targets that have to be hit in the process of doing that. And I think you've made the point yourself, and Ian did. These are long-term investments for periods of over 40 years. What we have proven through contestability, if I'm NIE or in whatever jurisdiction, I have a risk profile and I have a responsibility to assume a degree of risk, all of the risk, in fact. Therefore, I need to price that risk in. Through contestability, what you're doing is putting some of that risk or moving that risk onto the developer. So if you think of it in terms of an insurance premium is moved from NIE onto the developer. And as a consequence of moving that risk, we will have a different perspective on what that risk profile is. We will have closer, intimate knowledge of the project that we're delivering on. And therefore, we have, I suppose, in a sense, more knowledge. And in my opening remarks, I referred to that our experience of delivering contestability has seen savings in the region of 20 and up to 40% in the connection. So in the interest of the customer, then that gap, that 40% then, is the saving that is accrued to the customer as a consequence of that activity.
If, for whatever reason, you're taking on risk and the risk doesn't pay off, are there examples of that? And does the consumer therefore detriment if they're seeing the advantages where contestability works?
We haven't seen any of the situations where that has occurred to date, and certainly the fact that we're already making such significant savings by going down that road gives us a lot more headroom in terms of what we're designing into the cost of the project. But yeah, I mean, the principle is very well understood from a developer's perspective. In the regions where there is contestability, you take on that risk, and if you build out a shared asset that is allowing further projects to develop, you take on that. And if those projects don't materialise, you have to bear that cost. But as for the projects do materialise and connect, there's a rebate process back to you from those projects.
But if the rebate process doesn't materialise, then in answer to Mr. Agnews' question, then no, you're the one who made that decision to make that investment, and the risk is yours to bear.
But just, I suppose, the parallel scenario in a non-contestable world is that you are paying 20 to 40% more. So the customer is paying for a shared asset at a premium rate of 20 to 40% more through NIE or whoever builds it. But then you still have the risk that the other parties or projects don't materialise, and then the customer bears that, loss of that cost, which is 20 to 40% more than, so. It's,
As I said, the regulators and others have done studies of the impact of renewable energy on the price of energy in the single electricity market, and find that because zero marginal cost renewable energy has priority of dispatch, then the marginal price on the system is lower, and it's the marginal price that is the market price of electricity. So there is a benefit to the customer in having more renewables constructed, because it feeds back through the electricity price.
Although what we still don't have in that is kind of almost the payback period for the customer, the investment, the savings, and that's something I've been pushing for. So certainly if you have any information that can feed into that would be very helpful. If you came to us today with the one objective of saying contestability is the answer, you've succeeded, because that's what's coming through loud and clear. In terms of just one other solution, I suppose, that's been proposed to us by a number of our presenters, is the issue of smart technology. For you, is that a big could that be a big part of the solution, or is it a side issue? I mean, obviously, as I say, I've got the message contestability, we'll run with that, but how much of a role can smart technology play?
I take a little bit of it and then you want to pick it up. I think and maybe Bernice, you'll talk more about this, in terms of working with NIE have adopted a number of technology advancements in that space, such as dynamic line rating, which is a very important innovation in terms of how we maximise the use of the grid. And maybe Bernice, you might like to say a little bit more about that in a minute. The other piece, the smart space is fascinating. And the reason I say that is, up to this point, energy hasn't really changed much in 100 years. Generation moves across power line, customer consumes. We're now moving into a world where the customer will have more control, they will have more awareness of how they consume energy. That information will flow back through the grid and back to the generation stations in terms of how generation gets dispatched in the most efficient way possible. And what you find in the middle of that dynamic is a smart grid that's capable of utilising telecommunications technology to move information through the system and therefore limit the amount of investment that's actually needed in order to meet demand at a particular point in time. So a really interesting project that we're involved in includes Glendimplex, which is their quantum heating project. I was before this committee before speaking on this, where you have a load at the customer's home, and what you're doing is, for when the wind is blowing but there wouldn't be full demand for it, you can then take cheaper cost energy at that point of time and store it in a heating device, which is a very clever, efficient, maximising the full use of the physical assets that you have installed, thereby lowering the cost of those assets and lessening the amount of assets you have. So, and that's the tip of the iceberg where it comes to smart. But the analogy I always use is the telephone. Okay, if we remember what the telephone looked like 20 years ago, and then we remember when Nokia came out with its first handset, and now we look at the smartphones that we have today, this massive evolution in telecommunications technology, that is now starting to permeate itself into the energy sector, and how those two cross over each other in terms of how information flows in the system.
And just to add to that, I suppose, I think that, NIE and, Sony as prudent system operators must be always cognizant of, their priority to keep the lights on, and so they have to move. There will always be a time lag between these technologies, like in telecommunications, kind of filtering through to the electricity system, and that's rightly so. They must be inherently conservative and keep their priorities straight. But having said that, I would commend NIE and the steps that they have taken down that road. For example, the dynamic line rating schemes and special protection schemes, because what that does is it makes the most use of the existing network. So instead of having static ratings on lines based on the worst case scenario, really hot summer day, they can actually change the rating depending on the weather conditions and temperatures. So that's a really good way to maximise the utilisation of the infrastructure you have. And we've seen actually EirGrid and ESB networks to be much slower in Republic of Ireland in seeking to adopt those kind of technologies and test them, in a measured, controlled way. But NIE have gone down that road, so we'd commend them on that.
Okay.
Thanks. Thanks very much indeed for that. And just one thing, there's a bit of a no-brainer question, but I just want to put it on the record. You mentioned there, about the contestability issue and the movement of the risk, and indeed the reduction of the cost at that point in time. Just for the record, your financiers, and indeed from within the company and external to the company, obviously they look at that as a positive issue in terms of the making the connection more efficient, speeding things up, and getting them basically an efficient return for their money. Yes? Is it a good thing or a bad thing in terms of the confidence of the markets?
If you're looking at making an investment and you're looking at what's the net present value of this project, what is the cash flows of it going to be over your life expectancy, and what's the upfront capital cost? If you're reducing your upfront capital cost and your cash flows are positive, and you end up with a positive NPV, a financier is going to look at you and say you have a positive project. So if you can reduce your upfront capital,
on the record, because it's answered.
That's a positive thing. But ultimately, it's positive for the customer, which is where we have a lot of focus.
That's okay. Right. Thanks very much indeed. That proved very, very interesting indeed, and thank you for your time and being with us here today.
Thank you.
You're in better form today, Mr. Money, than you were the last day. Watching the flu,
Always.
Oh, do you remember? And any additional questions that we do have, if it's okay with yourselves, I know you're going to provide us with some
Yes,
information
I will,
about
yeah.
the
Timelines.
the flow
Yeah.
of the projects themselves and how you move from one stage to another in your ventures. That'll be very helpful. So if you're amenable enough, any additional questions that we do have, we'll supply those to you in writing if you're happy enough to answer them.
Certainly.
Brilliant.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Okay. And now we move to the next item on the agenda, which is agenda item number 5.
Get a chance to thank
Yes, no problem. Good to see you.
Thanks very much.
All the best.
Which is an oral briefing from Northern Ireland Electricity on electricity policy review part 3, grid connections. And papers for this item are at page 18 and include the clerk's brief at page 9. The
Seafront Road.
an NIE briefing on providing an overview on grid connections, page 23, an NIE briefing regarding connecting renewables, page 28, a briefing from Assembly Research on smart grids, page 44, correspondence from Wind NI regarding grid connection, and correspondence from Winter Renewables at page 53. We also have a written briefing from Invest NI on difficulties companies experience in relation to grid connections, that's tabled, and a news item from the BBC NI website published on the 28th of May 2014, that too is tabled. Now, with us here today briefing the committee are Mr Joe Mahoney, the Managing Director, Mr Robert Wasson, Asset Management Director, Mr Michael Atkinson, Head of Generation Connections, and Mr Peter Ewing, Deputy Managing Director of Regulation. You're very, very welcome. It's good to see you all again. Thanks for being with us. And as you know, the flow of the meeting, you're seasoned hands at this, up to 10 minutes in terms of presentation, and then we have a Q&A session from members. So, is it yourself, Joe? That's
yes, John.
Right. Please continue.
Yeah, I think you have our presentation, but
Yep.
just I suppose first of all, at the outset, to say that the network charge on the end user bill is about 20 to 25% for domestic electricity, and for large energy users, it's about 10% of the network charge amounts to. Every 5 years, the utility regulator reviews the prices which NIE is allowed to charge for its network services. Now, the RP5 price control applies from the period from the 1st of April 2012 to 30 September 2017, and was, as you know, referred to the Competition Commission in April 2013. The CC final determination was published on the 15th of April this year, and the CC agreed that it was a suitable case for reference, and very little of the utilities regulator determination was not revised by the Competition Commission. And the final determination brought closer alignment of the regulatory framework and reporting arrangements with Ofgem to GB regulator, and we very much welcome that. There was no retrospective adjustment to NIE's regulatory asset base. The committee will recall that there was a view that NIE had double charged its customers, and the CC, after an exhaustive investigation, found no evidence to support that. The return on the weighted average cost of capital is set at 4.1%, which is in line with the recent GB determinations. There will be a significant ramp up in network investment and rolling programmes and in the asset replacement programme as a result of this. Now, expenditure to support renewable generation and interconnection is subject to the approval by the utility regulator on a project-specific basis. So the decision of the Competition Commission will not impact on the connection of renewables or the 2020 targets in terms of funding. The regulator can approve that outside of this mechanism. Now, there was no allowance for network performance improvements, which is basically smart grids and remote control on our rural networks, and also no allowance for increasing the resilience of the 11 kV system. This is the rural system around the province against major events such as ice accretion. My colleague now, Robert Wasson, will just cover the renewables piece.
Thank you, Joe. Chairman and members, if you'll just bear with me for 5 minutes or so, I'll just go through some of the more specific renewables-related matters. Now, you also have a larger pack that we might refer to in the discussion today, and of course we're happy to have further engagement with members after today's session as well, and just let us know what you might need in that regard. So I think if we start by looking at the basic question, are the 2020 targets achievable? So two things are required. Firstly, the market has to bring forward enough developers and projects and to us that doesn't seem to be an issue, and we'll see some figures on that later on. So on the supply side, the projects are coming forward, would be our view. Now, secondly, those projects have to be connected to the grid, and that raises two issues. Firstly, there's the cost of the grid reinforcement. Now, you may recall from our last meeting, we mentioned a total overall cost figure of about £500 million, and that was made up of deep reinforcement to our transmission system, both at 110,000 volts, 110 kV, as we say, or 275 kV, and also for the north-south interconnector. And in relation to the funding of that, as Joe has mentioned, there is a mechanism under our price control for us to bring forward projects on a project-by-project basis for approval. So there's no issue around that, but ultimately the regulator has to make a decision on each of those. The second issue around grid development is planning and consents. Now, as we've seen in a number of projects, both north and south on this island, planning can be difficult. Can be quite challenging. It's been very challenging for the North-South Interconnector, as we all know, and it will be similarly challenging for some other elements of grid reinforcement that are necessary to enable the 2020 target, and particularly investments that would be required on the 275 kV network. So that's the higher voltage network typically that you see on pylons. Just before we go any further, I'd like to give a quick definition of what we mean by large-scale versus small-scale generation. So if you'd like to have a look at slide number 3 in the backing pack which you have. Let's talk to that for a second. So large-scale generation, by that we mean, so these are mainly wind farms. They tend to have an output of typically about 10 megawatts to 40 megawatts. Typically, just to put that in context a little bit, 5 megawatts would supply a small town. So that's to give some idea of the order of that. Now, quite a bit has happened in this regard. We've commissioned 31 of these wind farms already. They've been connected to the network in Northern Ireland. That's a total of about 552 megawatts as things stand today. And then in addition to that, there are about another 42 schemes which are in the pipeline. So there's quite a bit of activity there. Those other schemes are at various stages. Some of them are still in the planning process. Some of them have made their connection application to us. So that's large scale. Small scale, this is the, I suppose, the explosion of activity that we've seen around the province, particularly over the last couple of years. They tend to be, typically they're single wind turbines, usually in a rural setting. Typically, this would be a situation where, for instance, a farming family might put up a single wind turbine. In a lot of cases, it's a pension, really, which somebody is putting up rather than a wind turbine. They tend to be less than 250 kilowatts, which is a quarter of a megawatt. Also, some anaerobic digesters, they tend to be less than half a megawatt. The total there is we've connected about 250 of those around the province, and in terms of total output, that's about 65 megawatts. And I suppose just a point to make here, and we heard SSE before us making this same point as well. There's a bigger bang for the effort buck from large-scale wind farms. So, if you have, for instance, a 40 megawatt wind farm, that's the equivalent to dealing with, almost 4 times that, so 150 or 160 small scale. So if you can connect large wind farms, it gets you quickly towards the 2020 target. And then we've got quite a bit of activity at the moment happening, particularly in the last year or so, in terms of what we call micro generation. And this is typically a situation where somebody, for example, installs solar panels on their home. They fit and inform. So they don't apply to us as such. They tell us afterwards, and that is really taking off exponentially. So there's about at the moment the run rate is about 2 megawatts per month, which is going onto the system with those. So a lot of activity around that. So that's just to give a quick overview of what we mean by large scale versus small scale, because we'll use those terms probably throughout the morning. So I think it's, just go back to our overview slide. So it's important to understand the difference between the transmission and distribution networks and the challenges that we have on those. And those networks, enable the connection of large and small-scale renewables. So if we take transmission first of all, so this is about it's about our 110 kV and 275 kV systems. Typically the 110 kV on double wood pole structures, and we'll all have seen those around the countryside. The 275 tends to be on lattice steel pylons. So in relation to the reinforcement of those parts of the transmission network, there's an organised plan in place. Now, I'm just going to refer you again to another slide in the main pack on page 8, if you'd like to have a quick look at that. What we have here, moving from the left to the right, we're showing what we call our short-term plan, which is now complete, medium-term plan and a long-term plan. And really what's happening with these is we're starting with the low-hanging fruit in terms of the investment that's needed to release capacity on the system, and gradually as you move from 2010 to 2020 that becomes ever more expensive to do. So our short-term plan, that cost a very modest 3.2 million. It released quite a bit of capacity. To do that, we used some of the smart technologies, which again you would have heard SSE talking about, special protection schemes to get more out of existing overhead lines, and that released quite a bit. We're in the middle now of our medium-term plan. The overall cost of that will be about 60 million. We have approval for most of that from the regulator. And that's going to get us to about 1,000 megawatts capacity connected versus the 1,600 megawatts or thereabouts that we will need for the 2020 target. So we're well advanced down this road as well. By our calculations, we're enabling about 645 megawatts at the moment versus that 1,600 megawatts total. In terms of the where are we versus the 40% target, or indeed next year's 20% target, we're at about 16% at the moment, and the 20% of energy from renewable sources will be delivered in 2015. That seems to be the case. Once you move beyond the medium-term plan, we get into more difficult types of investments. So this is primarily where we would be reinforcing that sort of pylon 275 kV network, and together with the North-South interconnector, and both of these elements essential for delivering the 2020 targets, the cost of that is much more significant. So in total terms, that's about 420 million. So for that, two challenges. We've got the planning challenges associated with that, and also, the regulator would have to see the economic case for those investments as well. So those are the two challenges in getting us into that green territory from 2017 onwards, and enabling the connection of renewables up to the 1,600 megawatt total, leading us to the 40%. In terms of the other piece of infrastructure that we're putting in place to connect renewables, particularly large scale, we use the approach of the cluster substations, and you'll be familiar with that. And basically what happens there is we build a new substation which collects the output from a number of wind farms which are in the same location. So this makes a lot of sense because it's efficient. It reduces the impact on the environment. You're building less overhead lines. It's scalable. It's supported by the renewables industry. The regulator supports it. It's been, it has been consulted on by both ourselves and the regulator, and that approach is working well. There have been some difficulties in getting the rollout of the first couple of substations, but I think that plan is running quite well. So we've built 2 of those, and we've got 4 more that are various stages of advancement. Michael can tell you a bit more about that if you would like. 31 wind farms connected, as I've said, 40 more in the pipeline, and that's going fairly well. Now, in addition to that, you'll be aware of the offshore developments. So we've got potential of 200 megawatts of tidal and 600 megawatts of offshore wind, and I think that will come in 2 phases probably on the offshore wind. And on that front, we're engaging with the developers along with Sony. So again, those discussions are advancing fairly well. And that's going to be another element that will help to get us towards the 2020 targets. So if we could talk about distribution then for a second. So slightly different situation in relation to distribution. So this is where small-scale generation connects to mainly our 11 kV network. These are the networks that you see on single-pole wood lines all around the rural parts of the province. So we've connected a lot of small scale, in fact, about 65 megawatts in total, and we've got about another 85 megawatts in the pipeline, and that's a total of about 250 schemes. So there's been a lot done, but those distribution networks were never designed. They were never designed for renewables at all. They were designed for supplying load. They date from the networks date from the 1950s and 1960s. So they now need reinforcement. And we're seeing congestion happening in two ways, particularly in the west and the north of the province. So we're seeing congestion at 11 kV, and ultimately that has to be the correction of that and the reinforcement of the 11 kV to get round that issue has to be paid for by developers, and that is leading to some fairly expensive connection costs, quotations, which in some cases is making schemes unviable.
Can I just ask you there, Robert, please, this map that we have on the transmission reinforcement, is this the transmission reinforcement that is projected and needed, or is there some of this ongoing at the moment, just? Or some of it has happened?
Can I ask, Chair, which slide you're looking at there?
This is page 9.
Yes, that's actually showing. It's showing. If you look at the sort of the heavy blue lines, and we've got on the key there on the top right-hand side, we've got medium-term plan developments. So that's what's happening at the moment.
Sorry, I'm just in black and white and grey here. So.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Keeping costs down, obviously, by printing in black and white. So we've got there are some heavy lines, and on the key it says medium-term plans. So you can see that running from Tamnamore to Omagh, and also from Coleraine in the direction of Kells. So those are 110 kV reinforcements which are ongoing at the moment.
Right.
There's some lighter blue shading in some corridors. You can see that running, for instance, from the offshore wind in the direction of Tandragee and Castlereagh, and then you can also see a sort of a sea ring to the west of the province, and those are basically those would fall into the longer term 420 million developments that we were talking about. Just to draw a distinction.
That's grand. Thanks very much for that.
Okay. So just quickly to go back to the congestion issues on the distribution network. So apart from the 11 kV issue, which I've just mentioned, we're also seeing a need for 33 kV reinforcement. So this is the next level up in our distribution system. And reinforcement. So we're seeing the extent in some areas of small-scale renewables causing problems on the 33 kV system, and that's in relation to problems because power is flowing in a direction that it was never supposed to flow in. We have voltage control issues. We have some thermal issues where lines would be, basically running too hot and could cause clearance issues, for instance. So there's a safety issue there. And that has to be dealt with. The other reason that has to be dealt with is you've got to be very careful that issues on the 33 kV system don't in effect mean that you're now starting to constrain off wind farms that are already connected onto that system. So that just wouldn't make any sense at all. So we have to be careful of that. Now, at the moment, there is, as you may know from the final determination from the Competition Commission, there isn't a mechanism to pay for that 33 kV reinforcement. So as things stand, the only thing that we would be able to do would be to change our statement of charges such that those costs would be levied on the developers, which in most cases would mean that their schemes may not be viable. So that's something which the utility regulator is considering at the moment, and we've had some initial discussions with them, and that's to be worked through. So that's the essence of the 33 kV issue. Chair, I'm nearly coming to the end of. I know we're probably running slightly over time, but I'm nearly coming to the end of what I need to say. So going back to the 2020 targets. I think it's important to realise that large-scale renewables are going to contribute the major part of that. Probably 85 to 90% of those targets. As I've mentioned, significant further investment of some 420 million will be needed to enable that final step. So that needs regulatory approval, but also the projects have various planning challenges around them. So that's the plan is clear to get to the 27%. Moving from the 27% to the 40% is more challenging. Large-scale developers have, they've voiced their frustrations at the length of time needed to develop the connection methodology, the cluster approach, which I've mentioned. But as I've said, that we believe that that's the way forward. It's been accepted as making good sense by NIRIG, the developer body, by the utility regulator themselves, by DOE, by DOE planning. And we believe that that's the right thing to do. What we're focusing on is making sure that we get those clusters approved and built out more rapidly than has been the case over the last few months. So that's in terms of connecting those large-scale developers. That's the focus for NIE. So, Chair, that's a quick tour through some of the issues around connection of renewables as we see them, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, thanks very much for that indeed. Just on your final point there, and I was going to raise it because you touched on it earlier, the focus for you being the connection of the large farms. Does that mean to say you're prioritising them to the exclusion of others? And why I say that is, I have some figures in front of me here, and I think the source is Ofgem, where from 2010 up until present, the number of applications consented, i.e. those that received planning applications for the small-scale wind energy projects, is 779, and the number of those connected is 55. And it doesn't appear from these figures that, like, for example, in 2011 it was 135 consented, 5 connected. 2012, 313 consented, 30 connected. 2013, 281 and 13 connected. And I presume you wouldn't dispute those figures, but are you prioritising those big wind farms to the exclusion of these other smaller connections?
The quick answer, the straight answer to that is no, we're not. I mean, we're not. We can't discriminate between different types of generation or classes of generation, so we don't do that. Effectively, the large wind farms and the smaller scale generation are connecting at different parts of the network. So in fact there are different parts of our team dealing with that. So for instance, Michael has a part of his team which deals with large scale. He's got a different team which deals with small scale. So those two things are being done in parallel.
Okay.
Maybe can I? Sorry, it is. I understand now some of the statistics you're referring to there, which suggest a lower rate implementation of the smaller scale schemes. I think it's fair to say that around the time of 2012, certainly, whilst we were processing a large number of applications and actually agreeing quite a large number of applications, there were some technical issues around the implementation of the small schemes. We refer to them, for example, earthing difficulties, which is a rather technical term, which did slow down the actual process of getting the schemes through to the final construction and connected. But equally, the statistics now from 2012 onwards, 2013 and into 2014, and indeed the pipeline of work of schemes that is now agreed and in the final stages of construction has increased quite markedly. And that's why the volumes of connected megawatts we're now seeing 65 megawatts, for example, of smaller schemes connected, another 85 megawatts in that final stage of the delivery pipe, which means that small scale and the stats that will come through to Ofgem and the claimants against the ROCs will be going up very markedly over the next 6 or 12 months. So I understand the point from that statistical line, but I could give you some considerable assurance that the volume of work now on small scale going into the final delivery stages is moving to a very high level.
The figures that I have here at 2012 is 313 consented, 30 connected, and then it seems to dip worse again for 2013 to
Yeah.
281 and 13 connected.
Those figures for 2013 wouldn't tally with our numbers, to be honest. So I would maybe suggest that we check those figures with you, because clearly the number of megawatts we're connecting certainly and through 2013 would have been an order above 2012. But I take the point, and it's a question.
We can get these
clarified.
checked for verification.
Sure.
Then can we move on then to an issue which has come up, and I'm sure your PR people have been reporting it back to you. One of the key issues is the slowness in connection. Now, and it would appear, and when people are saying that NIE have monopoly in the grid connection market, and do you feel, in the interest of efficiency, in the interest of the economy, that should be perceived to be the case?
Well, we would fully support the introduction of contestability in grid connections. It's been done in GB, it's been done in ROI.
Yes.
I think that's worked well for developers have sought it. It has worked well. We would welcome the UR bringing forward proposals, and we work with them to try and ensure that that's introduced without delay.
You heard there the difference that it's making in terms of I put the point there at the very end in terms of
absolutely,
not just investors but customers, and how that could move on. Well, and we heard the experience in England and from the rest of the island here about that. But one of the things, and again I'll put this to you, the actual, we'll read this, next to turbine costs, grid connection costs in Northern Ireland are likely to be the most expensive component of installation jointly with construction costs. While this cost is around 10% in Great Britain, experience in Northern Ireland shows it to be closer to 20% and in some cases 50% of the total cost of the installation. Now, clearly there's something maligned or something way off kilter there whenever that's happening. So if you support contestability, and if you support more liberalisation of the capacity to actually do those connections, you feel it's a good thing. What's the obstacle to making it happen then?
Could I maybe pick up just the point you've suggested there, that the costs of connection in Northern Ireland are considerably higher as a percentage, and I would accept that, and I'd like to qualify it, please. If we were looking at the figures back around 2012, before the network became very congested, as it is now, typically the cost of connection for a 250 kilowatt machine, which would be the standard size, may have been in order of 60 or 70,000 pounds. As a result of some of the technical issues that arise with congestion, where further reinforcement of the network is required, not just the immediate connection of the turbine, but also further reinforcement of the network is required. The costs that have been levied on developers have gone up very, very markedly. So whereas it may have been 60 or 70,000 pounds, we would frequently be seeing costs now of maybe average costs of 180,000 pounds, and in some circumstances there would have been costs in excess of 300,000 pounds. What I would clarify there, though, is that is not because NIE is applying a high unit cost to the work. The actual work content in Northern Ireland for these connections on a relative basis is very high compared to what it is on the mainland, where they're dealing with less congested networks, basically.
Well, I'll maybe flip that over to you. It would appear, and we're doing this too, is that other sectors involved in terms of actual efficiency of getting it done and costs of getting it done appear to be, the practice seems to be, or the experience seems to be, that it can be done more efficiently, more quickly and cheaper.
Yeah.
I'm sure while I hear you're presenting the case for the North here as being unique, I'm sure it's not that unique by comparison to some of the Highlands or Islands of Scotland, or indeed some parts of Wales, or indeed other parts of GB, where the network, or the south for that matter, where the network may need the same sort of capacity building as is needed here in parts of, I think, the Sperrins and places like that. I hear that argument, but I can't see it as being one size fits all.
May I just maybe try that again? The network in Northern Ireland is of relatively light construction, certainly in the west of the province, it would be of lighter construction. And as a consequence of that, as the amount of generation that connects increases, typically reinforcement requirements will arise at an earlier stage and will be more significant. The other side of the comparison with the other parts of the United Kingdom is that as their networks have become more congested, they have experimented in other methods of connecting wind turbines. Whereas in Northern Ireland at the minute, we still operate on the basis that the turbine is effectively guaranteed its full output onto the network when it connects. On the mainland, where they've run into congested areas, and we're doing some comparisons at the minute with the mainland, they have experimented with alternative methods of connection, offering choice, introducing smarter solutions, which means that the immediate connection costs in some of those cases would be a lot lower than they are in Northern Ireland, because they get rid of the need for the same level of reinforcement. And we'll touch on some of that later on, but it's maybe just to give you one line of response on that one.
Chair, just to add to that, and Michael, you might want to come in again. One of the things that we're doing in response to the industry is we're taking a closer look at what's been happening in GB. And we've been talking to the regulator about this. We have their support. We've been talking to DETI. We have their support, and we've talked to, just this week actually, to NIRIG as well about some initiatives that we're planning to roll out over the next 6 months or so. So in effect, what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at both large scale and small scale. From a point of view of asking ourselves, are the ways that we can, if we take small scale or large scale first of all, are there things that we can do to make the rule book work better, in terms of queuing protocols and so forth. On small scale, we're having a look at some of the technical challenges there and asking ourselves, are there approaches that we can take in Northern Ireland that might have been taken in GB, for instance, which would allow more capacity to be released from the system. And I think one of the things we're going to take a hard look at there is an alternative to the firm connection type of approach, where basically a developer would have the opportunity to have something that's less than firm, which would mean that they would have a lower connection cost. So it's been done with some success in several DNOs. We've enlisted the services of a recognised expert from Electricity North West. We've started some work internally with him in NIE, and we'll be heading into a process of workshops to work through this with the industry and with the regulator, and indeed with DETI over the coming months, ultimately leading to a consultation on changes which would happen, probably Q3, I think, Michael.
We'd be looking for implementation October, November.
Yeah.
That's what.
Well, and I'm asking you as the experts in this field, in terms of opening up the market to more competition around connections and that,
yes.
What's required?
Well, there's no, you mentioned, Chair, obstacles. Actually, there are no obstacles. This is an open door. So really all that's required there is for the regulator to define how they would like this to happen, and to engage with ourselves and engage with the industry. From NIE's perspective, I suppose our main concern is that ultimately we would have to take over any contestable connection that is built. So we would take responsibility for that, and we would have to operate it and maintain it. So clearly our main concern is that that's built to the right standards and so forth. But that's all easily worked through.
Well, you'd be presuming that those companies coming in would be sufficiently skilled, if they're doing it elsewhere, sufficiently skilled to do it.
Yes, but that can be verified, and that's there's a model, there's a model in terms of how this has been done elsewhere. It's been been in the Republic successfully for quite some time, also in GB. So that model can be followed.
From your own point of view, you're happy enough to support that?
No, we welcome it, and as soon as we need to do something on that for the regulator, we'll support that.
Okay. Yeah. Right. We'll move over to Mr. Dunn. Gordon.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks very much, gentlemen, for coming in again. A number of issues have been covered, and you had the benefit of listening in. One big concern, obviously, is the planning process, and I suppose we get the message out there that there's a reluctance by NIE to engage with potential developers, until they have the planning approval through. So I think that's an issue we would like your opinion on. It's an issue that, as elected representatives, we get quite a bit of feedback on. We appreciate the point is made about the risk of hoarding of capacity, which is one that perhaps could be dealt with or managed in a different way. But we've had the evidence there today from about the Sleeves Davina project, which to me seems totally unacceptable. But obviously there are reasons for the delay, which we'd like to hear about. But their project time they've got their approval in 2007. The estimated date now for connection from yourselves is March 17. That's 10 years. It's a long, long time. And then they had the prior lead-in before, and that. So altogether, the whole project will run about 13 years, which seems unacceptable. So I'd like your opinion and your comments on those couple of issues first of all, please.
Okay. I'll maybe try to answer both those points. In terms of the engagement with developers during the planning process, I would split that into two broad areas. In terms of the large scale, where we're dealing with probably a much smaller number of developers and typically much bigger projects, there would be frequent engagement on a regular basis with all those developers, whether they're at the planning stage, post-planning application stage or whatever. We do have very firm rules that we don't recognise an application as a bona fide application until the planning approval has been agreed, and we would strongly remain of that view that that's the best way to run the regime. However, during planning processes with larger developers, we will frequently engage. We may be asked to do feasibility studies determining the likely way that connection is going to take place or whatever. The developers will pay a fee for that, but that arrangement normally works quite well. I think.
Who does it work? Sorry, is that put out to consultants?
Well, we would do a considerable amount of it in-house. We do have some strategic consultants that we have on a sort of procured panel of consultants that we would use for some of the very technical design aspects. But we would be frequently engaging in that process with the larger scale developers, and I would sort of suggest that I feel that arrangement works quite well. With small scale developers, we equally would still believe that the requirement of planning permission before the application is recognised is the right way to do it. In terms of engaging with small-scale developers in advance and when they're either before they go into the planning process or after they come out of it, there's a huge, there is a huge volume of developers and parties involved in that process. We do and have done feasibility studies in advance when requested to do so by developers, but because it is such a fast-moving part of the market, developers will have concerns that a feasibility study may almost be out of date by the time it has been handed to them, because the feasibility study doesn't, or any budget assessment doesn't really allow the developer to book his capacity or any certainty of what his connection is going to look like until his planning has been agreed, until he's got his application in. So it's a more challenging area to deal with in terms of engagement during the planning process. The view we have taken, and it mirrors some of the comments that I was listening to earlier about providing information to developers at an earlier stage in the small scale to try and allow them to understand whether schemes may or may not be feasible. We do have a strong view now that, having had some experience with putting or developing what we call a heat map and making that available on the network, that if we're able to take the heat map to another level of granularity and also accompany that with some general mapping information on the website, that developers may, on a fairly quick basis, be able to get an early view as to whether their schemes may or may not be viable. And we feel that certainly as a first step, that is something that we're going to be undertaking to do in the relatively short term.
That's not available at the moment.
The heat map itself is available. It's actually there's a version of the heat map in your pack. It's a page. But what I'm suggesting there is that whereas that heat map has generally actually been quite helpful to people who are either clearly in an area which isn't under pressure or an area that is, that heat map can go to another level of detail. It can go to a method where people could access on the website, and if they know their postcode, for example, they know their the location, they could focus in more clearly and see not just is the general area looking busy and congested, but is the particular line that they're trying to connect onto at the minute looking very busy or likely to be costly. And we do feel that that would be a useful step forward, well, a very useful step forward, and one that could work well in an environment where there are lots of developers, and there's lots of developers also looking at lots of options. So, you know, you've literally got thousands of potential sites out there that developers are trying to get a view one way or the other on. It's a very different scene to the larger scale developer community.
Now, is this a heavy demand on your resources then, dealing with all of this?
The processing of applications generally it's a very intense process at the minute, not least because as the network has become busier, the nature of the actual assessment of each application, rather than just saying where's the nearest line that we can connect onto, which is where most people's starting point is. Most developers will look and say, well, am I close to a line? Can I get connected onto a line? The actual electrical analysis that needs to be done needs to look much deeper into the system once the network gets congested. And that design work is quite intensive, it's quite specialist, and it certainly does put pressure on resources. Having said that, we've injected a considerable number of additional resources into that area of the business over the last year, and we feel we're coping reasonably well. But we need to sort of deploy our resources on a proportionate basis to the areas where we feel we can get the most value of having them.
What about a quotation? We get feedback about the length of time it takes for quotations.
Yeah.
What's a reasonable time for say for a small, even for a PV connection?
Well,
first of all, for a quotation, and then the length of time to make it.
The PV connections themselves at the very small level, what are generally termed G83 is the sort of technical term against it. The small solar panels, for example, the PVs that you'll see much more of now on individual dwellings, basically are connected on a fit and inform basis, so they don't go through a complicated application process. They basically fit the panels and they sign a level of certification to say that those panels have been installed to a certain standard, and we accept that.
Yeah.
As you start to move up beyond that, and to be honest, once you move not much beyond that, we get into a situation really where any application which has got a substantive number of kilowatts associated with it needs to be assessed in the context of the overall impact of the network. Now, you might say, well, some of these small schemes sound quite small in size and are likely to have a significant impact. But if you imagine we're processing 600, 700 in some cases applications a month for small-scale solar, the actual impact on our network over the last 12 months has been very considerable, and we do need to assess those on a non-discriminatory basis with other applicants that are coming into the frame as well.
If I could just step in for a second there, Michael. There are complexities to this, and you do tend to have, within a community, you tend to have a number of people who will have the idea of installing small scale all at the same time. So there's an interaction of these things technically which needs to be carefully managed. Now we have to give quotations within 90 days. And in a lot of cases, we would come close to that 90 days.
Seems excessive, to the ordinary man on the street.
Well, if I could just state a statistic this morning. We had 600 applications last year for small scale. This year to date, we had 3,000. So you can see it's a big workload. And 90 days is a stretching target for us to reach.
Stretching target?
It is. Well, if you have 3,000 as opposed to 600 last year, it's gone up exponentially.
To some extent, I know people have raised this as a negative thing, and I hesitate just slightly before what I'm about to say because I don't want it to sound arrogant, but in a way, I think it's a little bit of a red herring. If I was a small scale developer, I don't think I would be terribly concerned whether I was getting my quotation in 60 days versus 88 days. My concern would be how much is this quotation for and when is it going to be built out. Actually, those are the real issues. But I do accept that people have, and I think it's maybe because of wider frustrations that they've also raised the quotation issue. But as I say, if I was a developer, I don't think it's the thing that would be keeping me awake at night, really.
Well, maybe if you're. But the issue, the other point was made, and it's been made to us, and the chairman's very much aware of it as well. This issue about the connection type G59. You know, that seems to be one that you're holding very tight, and we have had approaches from various people who believe that they can come up with a solution, a technical solution to the problem. And as I understand it, I'm not an electrical engineer, electrical background, but I have a bit of mechanical knowledge. But it basically stops the risk of leakage out onto the grid. Are you prepared to look at that, a solution like a technical solution?
Just before, Michael, you answer that, just a general point in terms of, I suppose, the care which NIE takes over generation connections, and maybe just to be helpful, I think, to keep this into perspective a little bit. We have an obligation, and indeed it's a licence obligation to all of our existing customers, and the majority of whom are load customers. Now we have 840,000 of those. They're domestic customers, they're small businesses, they're large industry and so forth, and we have an obligation to keep the electricity supply safe, economical, to quality standards and so forth, and that's as I say, it's a licence obligation. It's something we take very seriously. So the developer community sometimes vent frustration that NIE takes time, and we hear words like over-conservative used from time to time. We wouldn't apologise for that. We are conservative when it comes to connecting new generation to the network, which was never designed for that. We take our time and we make sure that that's done correctly, and that's because we're balancing the needs of those 840,000 versus probably about 25 large-scale developers. Several hundred small-scale developers. So that has to be kept in balance. So I think it's just sorry to preface, Michael, what you were going to say in particular on the G83 question.
Well, yeah, there was a reference there to. I mean, I think really the territory we're in here is the cut-off point between the smaller PV arrangements and the typical sizes you'll have heard in the conversation are 3 to 4 kilowatts. Single phase, and about 11 kilowatts, 3 phase. But beyond that point or that size of an installation, we are insisting that the developers apply under what we call the G59 process, which is similar to the single wind turbines, and in our view is the appropriate interpretation of the legislative requirements that we are bound to, and it is also consistent with trying to manage the network in a fair and equitable basis with the other small developers who are trying to connect single wind turbines. So where a single wind turbine comes to us with a 50 kilowatt application, or a PV applicant comes to us with a 50 kilowatt application, we treat them on the same basis. Now, you're saying, are we prepared to look at it again? I think what we will do as part of the engagement we're having with the industry is we will test each other's understandings and we will explore why the interpretations are different. That doesn't mean we feel we're doing anything the wrong way, but we're more than happy. It's an important issue with the industry, and we're more than happy to go through the engagement again to develop an understanding of why we're doing things the way we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in relation to the G59, I understand, especially west of the Bann, it is difficult to make the connection.
But if you appreciate, and I'm sorry to maybe interrupt you, it's still, regardless of whether we deal with it under G83, which is basically where the PVs connect without having to be considered in the wider network, or the G59 where they are considered, ultimately they're all contributing to the congestion. The small PV and the larger PV are equally contributing to the congestion problems that we have on our network. And from our point of view, as I say, to operate and to design things prudently, we need to take account of all that energy that is coming onto our network, particularly as it's getting very congested now in the west.
So you're prepared to have a look at it?
No, I mean we're looking at it. We're certainly not making any promises about changing, but we feel our position is a solid position. But we're absolutely happy to go through the discussions and the arguments again.
Okay, gentlemen.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Just one, if I could pick up on one point you were saying there, the increase in the number of applications up to 3,000, I think you said it was, Joe.
Yeah.
Well, forgive me for saying so, but your business, they're not exactly getting it done for nothing.
No,
And from a business point of view, a lot more people are coming to you as customers with a lot more opportunities to make money in your point of view. So I'm just wondering how you adapt and change to that to avail of those opportunities.
well, as Michael has stated, Chairman, we put more resources into the area. And I'm not complaining about 3,000 applications. It's great, but I'm just saying that this workload has been increasing steadily over the last 2 years.
Well, could you maybe just give us some indication as to what resources have been put into that area?
Well, might I
okay.
might I maybe just take that one? Because there's quite a few numbers moving around at the minute here, and just need to sort of keep a wee bit of control on it. Joe's quite right in terms of the very small-scale solar applications, and many of those will be connected on what we call a fit and inform basis. There's not maybe a huge amount of administrative work, certainly less than in some of the larger ones. We've seen maybe our applications for the full year last year for small solar was 600 for the full year. We've now seen that for the year to date so far we've had 3,000 applications already. Now that's at the relatively small end of the market, and many of those connections require a relatively small administration around them. The general connection levels for the single wind turbines, which is the main source of business, it has gone up probably from around 400 applications per annum in 2011-12 to a figure of about 600 applications per annum that we're seeing at the minute, and that's the larger small-scale generation, the single wind turbine.
No, I appreciate that.
I'm just trying to make sure there's a wee bit of consistency. Before I answer your question on resources, is to try and give a flavour.
The point being that these aren't unanticipated. These are ones which, as we've heard, all the merits that have been funded by others about getting planning permission first.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's not as if they're coming just completely out of the blue. These are ones that you can determine just by even looking at or ringing up planning service and saying, how many wind turbines, single turbines have you got in the pipeline here?
Absolutely. Now, the thing is, though, that as we have recognised that increase, and particularly we've seen the 400 moving up towards 600 per annum, we have resourced up considerably within the section. And I mean, you're talking about numbers. If we look at the core of the office function that processes these applications, we would have, for small-scale generation alone, we'd have an order of 23 or 24 people permanently tied up in that area of the business processing these applications.
These are admin office-based?
Well, they're not. Yes, I would describe it as office-based, but it tends to be a combination of design engineers, planning people, and some people who you would describe more as pure administrative type resources. But that number of sort of 23, 24 is up from an order of 15 or so that we would have had 12 or 15 months ago, and we have ramped up to try and match the.
And what about the ones that do the actual nuts and bolts stuff?
Well, the workforce on the ground, I would suggest to you, is much less of an issue. We have a very large workforce delivering connections generally, be they a normal load-related connection or a connection relating to a wind turbine, and those resources are more than capable of dealing with the wider remit of generation connections also. And the point I think that's important here, because you're probably thinking, well, why does it take so long to connect the wind turbines? It's not the actual physical building and constructing that takes the time. That's typically done within eight weeks or so at the end of the process. The big portion of the time is occupied by the design of the earthing arrangements for the substations, and also particularly the way-leaving and consenting arrangements that need to be agreed with local landowners. And that tends to be the biggest single issue that we face here. It's the time to get the full legalities progressed before we can then move the job into what we describe as the final construction stage. Construction, and I'm sure if you ask people specifically about it, they will tell you that once the construction work starts, the job's normally done within 6 or 8 weeks.
And some of the issues on way leaving are, I mean, it's no different to what we would encounter sometimes when we're trying to do other construction work. So you can have silly situations where there are two neighbours who haven't been speaking for 20 years, and one of them wants to put up a wind turbine, but it requires a line to go over the neighbour's land, and lo and behold, you have a problem with the way leave, and that's quite difficult to.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, Robert, and hear what you're saying, because not that often, but you encounter that with just a standard plan application for a house which is requiring sight lanes.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't expect that to be entirely the pattern. You get that in country areas and the likes, but it's the exception, not the rule. So I could understand that holding it up, because somebody says, you're not going across my ground. That's it.
That's right.
Could I maybe just challenge you on that point you made there, because we find it is increasingly an issue now as more and more wind turbine developers are trying to get connected onto the network. They know that there's because there's limitations in capacity, remaining capacity, they know that they're to some extent potentially in a battle with their neighbours as to whether they're going to get connections. And we do find in many cases now, in some of the busy areas of the province, that there's much greater reluctance on local landowners to give access. And that has been an escalating situation.
Thanks for that. Just one other thing, and we'll provide this to you in writing. We have some evidence here from Invest NI about difficulties and problems that slowness or lack of movement in some instances on connection to the grid is creating for them. So we can't really bounce it on you today here, but we'll provide you a written copy of this. It's among members' table papers, and you can respond in writing to us, please, just if that's okay. Move then to Mr. Agnew. Stephen.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies for having to nip out midway through your presentation. So if I say something that's already been covered, tell me. It's my own fault. We'll move on, and I'll not waste your and the committee's time by having you repeat yourself. If I was to put it to you, and I'm not suggesting this from myself, but perhaps just from some of the evidence we had, that NIE as an organisation is conservative, adverse to change and innovation, and a barrier to progress, and behaves like a monopoly despite regulation, what would your response be?
Well, we would disagree with it. So why would we disagree with it? Well, first of all, we are a monopoly, but we're, because we're a natural monopoly, and of course that's why we're regulated in the way that we are. But to address the question, do we innovate? And we would say yes, we do innovate. In fact, I think SSE, in fact, mentioned this in just prior to us. So, for example, when you look at the very conservative spend that we put in place for our short-term plan to get us going on the connection of renewables, less than 2 million was spent on releasing about 300 megawatts of capacity, and we did that through innovation. So we put in place special relays, protection schemes, in quite an innovative way, so that we could squeeze more capacity out of that existing system. We've done things like adopt. It's not always about electronics either. So we've done things like adopting new conductors for our transmission lines that can be run at much hotter temperatures, and therefore you can get more current through them and a greater capacity from a circuit without having to rebuild that circuit. As I mentioned, I think prior to when you came in, we're continuing that as well. We're engaging with the industry, looking to practice in the UK in terms of what they've done to be able to connect more small-scale generation on the existing networks with perhaps less investment. So I would say we are innovative. Now, we had, just to mention, I think one of the disappointments that we had in our price control was that the Competition Commission remained unconvinced at the argument that we made for innovation funding. So if you look at the funding for innovation that we would have versus what would be typical in a DNO, it's almost nothing. And we think that that's very poor value for the customer. I would say it's something that will be corrected in our next price control, but for the next 2 to 3 years, we need to just find a way to do what we need to do, and that's what we're intending to do.
One of the examples that's come up, and I hope I get the type of technology right here, is it the reverse power relay that's needed for renewables?
Yes.
It can't get the grid connection, perhaps in time or whatever, wishes to power its own facility.
Yes.
But obviously there's concerns with the grid. My understanding is in GB that technology has been accepted as safe, but you haven't accepted it here in Northern Ireland. What would the reason be for that?
We did. This was an item that we covered when you were out, actually. Okay. So, and what we said, Stephen, was that we're open to looking at that. But we did say that we're not apologetic about being conservative in how we develop the network, and that's because of our responsibility to a wider customer base of 840,000, and we have to keep the network safe and reliable and keep supply quality up. But we're open to looking at that particular matter, and we're intending to do that.
The strategy for grid investment, I think you've been here before and you've said that you don't turn down applications as such if they can be funded and the planning permission, etc. They go ahead. It seems quite a responsive approach. Is there, running alongside that, a strategic approach of development in the grid, or is it literally demand-led, demand of developer-led?
And sorry, we're talking about renewable generation in particular here.
Well, in particular, yes, the upgrades needed in terms of bringing on the greater proportion of renewables.
So yes, just to talk to that for a second. In terms of so we talk about large scale, the market will throw up various developers who are interested in developing projects, and it will throw up various projects, and we have some sight of those as those start to roll out. So to connect those, we're doing a couple of things. The medium-term plan, which you'll see referred to in the pack, really is a background investment in the 110,000 volt network to make sure that that's able to primarily, what we're doing there is we're trying to get power transferred from the west of the province, where the wind is and where there isn't much of the load, to the east of the province where the load is. So that medium-term plan is aimed at doing that and helping us to connect more of those networks. And then slightly longer term, we've got the further investments of 420 million, part of which is for about 100 million or so is for the interconnector, and the balance of that is for further investments, particularly on the 275 kV network, and again a lot of that in the west of the province. So that's I suppose the backbone investments which we're planning. And then in addition to that, and the bit that's a little bit more reactive, is the commissioning of cluster substations. So as you get a sort of I suppose a group of wind farms developing in a particular locale, then we'll seek to put a cluster substation in to supply those. But those are also reasonably well known.
Is there a certain amount of predictability of the investment that's likely to come in? I mean, there's a relatively small number of companies that can afford these types of wind farm investments. Presumably you're engaging with them on current projects. Are you working with them to assess future projects that are likely to come, and is that where you can be at least moving along together?
Well, yeah, the answer is yes. We are engaging with Michael. Just to expand on that a little bit.
I think we've sort of given a bit of a flavour in the pack, and just see if I can find the slide here. But it's maybe worth picking up on this point in terms of not just the amount of wind that's currently connected, but we've also given an indication on slide 6. We've given a wee bit of a breakdown there on slide 6. There's no number on slide 6, but you can work it out. It's after slide 5. On the top right, where we've given an indication there of the amount of megawatts that's currently connected, for example, on large scale, which is in order of 550 megawatts. But in addition to that, we have another 328 megawatts of delivery agreed. That's work where the money's already been paid. We've got, beyond that, we've 122 megawatts of live offers, and we've got another 196 coming down the road at us in terms of applications. We're also aware of about 600 megawatts further that's in the planning process, and the developers generally in that territory are ones that we're quite well acquainted with. We're meeting with on a regular basis. and we know what their plans and aspirations are. I think fundamentally what we're doing in terms of planning ahead and the work that we've sort of got all signed up to at the minute is the remaining part of what Robert has described to the medium-term plan work, which is essentially development of 110,000 volts up into the north and across into the west, to make the network strong enough to accommodate the clusters that we've already got earmarked in with construction approval with the regulator, so that by 2017 that medium-term plan, in conjunction with a number of strategic clusters, will be in place to take those additional work that's coming through the pipe and connect around that sort of timeline. I think the question in terms of strategy then arises as to how well we're equipped to go beyond that, up from that level, which is at around the 27% mark of the renewables, on up to the 40%, because that's where you step into requiring investment up at 275,000 volts. We know the clusters that need to be implemented as well within that timeline, and they're already in the initial stages of development. But I think the big challenge is how we are going to get that further, more substantive investment in the rail backbone, the 275,000 backbone agreed. And I think that's a bit of the jigsaw that hasn't quite been worked through finally or agreed yet with the approval authorities. But it does mean that we can get to about 27%, both in terms of the enabling capacity of the network, and also we can see the developers who are going to connect to give that sort of level of output at that sort of timeline.
Okay. In terms of, to some extent, related to what we heard, you weren't here for the previous presentation, but around some of the connection issues and planning for developers, a big thing came in was certainty of timelines of grid connection in particular, and something I've heard, there's been the argument about whether or not you should run along parallel with planning or in a step approach. The kind of middle ground seems to me is that you can give at least an estimate, not an offer, but an estimate of costs. In terms of that, given an estimate of timeline, and fairly, I think they do need the level of certainty and that kind of estimate of budget. Is there any progress towards that? Is there a reason why we can't move in that direction?
I think the good example that was referred to by SSE was a Slieve Davina connection, which had probably been in the system since the mid-2000s. And it's a good example, but probably at one end of the spectrum. They had come in an application, they got their planning permission back in around 2007, and it was sort of, as we were moving beyond that point, that NIE was having to, in conjunction with the regulator, try to work out what the best way to connect potentially quite a high volume of wind farms coming into the system was going to be. And we did get into considerable and very lengthy discussions and debates around the advantages of moving from more individual-based connections, long runs back to primary substations, getting into a more structured and efficient method of connection, which was the cluster methodology. And admittedly, it did take some time to work that through. We'd got approval in principle from the regulator in 2011. There was various determinations and challenges arose at a certain point, which almost caused the industry to go into hiatus for about 2 years after that. And Slieve Davina would be one example of a project that got significantly held up or delayed as a result of that. But now that we've got the cluster methodology agreed, we've got the medium-term plan lined up, and we can see these cluster delivery times coming in 2016, early 2017, we would suggest that that plan is much better organised, but there's still a fair bit of pressure on NIE and other parties to make sure that we deliver now those clusters within that timeline to 2017, because the incentives that sit around this for developers potentially change quite dramatically once they move from the early part of 2017. Beyond that, the actual method of reward moves from ROCs to feed-in tariffs and things like that. So that early 2017 date becomes a critical date that we're all working to now, and it requires us to work smartly, and it also requires us to interjoin up with the regulator in terms of getting some of the approvals to work smartly as well. So there's big challenges there, but I would suggest to you that it's in a much more organised state than it was 3 or 4 years ago.
Just to mention, I think that engagement with the developer community is very important. So we, and Michael in particular, and along with myself, we invest quite a bit of time in interacting with them. So we do that at individual developer level. We do it with NIRIG. We were with them as recently, their committee yesterday, in fact, and we meet NIRIG every 6 weeks or so. We also do it it through the Renewables Grid Liaison Group, which is chaired by the regulator. And ourselves and Sony and NIRIG would be very keen that we get the SEDWIG process re-established again, and that's the cross-departmental process around grid planning. So in fact we are all going to be writing in the next few days to the Minister to suggest that.
Okay. Right. Very, very briefly,
Okay.
I've allowed a fair degree of latitude.
Yes,
on this,
no,
and
no,
there's a couple of members looking to come in.
It's just, I suppose, two questions, but very, very quick questions.
Very quickly.
Tied
A quick
together.
response, please.
Do you foresee a stage where you could give, we will deliver within X days, weeks, months? And just kind of in relation to that certainty, do you have plans to revise your heat map?
The heat map will be revised shortly. We were mentioning earlier, I'm not sure Stephen's in for it. We are going to develop the heat map. We're going to update it and develop it to another level down. At the minute it shows general areas. We think a sensible way to take information sharing forward is to develop it to the next level down, where we show the individual lines and feeders colour coded. So the answer to that one, definitely yes. In terms of guaranteeing timelines to the nearest day or week, probably not to that level. But in terms of those big deadlines we need to meet in late 2016, early 2017, we're confident that we can meet those, and those are going to be the crunch deadlines for us.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that.
Thanks very much.
We have a number of other questions that we have here, gentlemen, and if it's okay with you, we'll submit those in writing. We could probably spend all day on this very interesting topic, but the constraints of the clock are upon us. Mr. McKinney, Fergal.
Oh, thanks very much indeed. And can I also apologise for not being in for your present? I'm trying to practice the art of being in two places at once. But one of the most interesting things I think you've said, for me anyway, is the extent to which you're now getting new applications. So you're up to 3,000. And I know you're explaining some of the deeper down knowledge around those, but isn't it a reality that that demand is impacting both on the process and the actual connection?
I certainly agree that the level of applications is very high. I think we need to just understand how that is broken down, and I know you sort of heard some of that. It's a very high level of applications, but I would suggest to you that we have manned up considerably. The level of expertise that's required in this area to process the applications is quite high. It's not immediately easy to pick, lift people off the street who can do this sort of work, and we've devoted or deployed some of our best people into that area. And we have, for example, if I can give you, some encouraging signs here, whereas we were struggling somewhat about a year ago in this territory, we've now got to the stage where, as we're moving through the application process, albeit we do take the 90 days, and I don't see us changing from that in the short term, we are able, at an early stage or a much earlier stage now in that process, if it turns out that an application is likely to result in a very high cost, we do actively ring the developer. We have a discussion with them. We'll even iterate their application again if they want to try for a smaller size to see if that'll fit in. But that all adds to the amount of work that's been done within that period as well. So I think we're working better, smarter within the period, but I wouldn't be offering to take the period back at the minute.
And I mean, you're a business, and you want to keep all that demand and work within it, but is it now reaching the point when actually competition is what's needed?
Well, I think, as Robert said, we fully expect competition to come down the road at us. The questions, I think...
The point I'm making is, are we not at that point now?
Well, my understanding certainly is that the regulator intends to consult quite shortly on competition, and we'll be an active participant in that. Whether it will bring, major changes or improvements for developers, we can't really speculate, but we do feel that whereas we would be criticised at the minute for issues around cost and timeline, we do believe that there are some genuinely solid reasons for some of those difficulties that will not entirely be resolved purely from competition.
But we welcome contestability, and as soon as the regulator is ready to start working through that, we'll be there to work through it with them.
And we have already covered this.
No, I understand that, but it's just that specific point in around the demand, right? Not just the competition, but the fact that demand is there now and should be a driver to increase the activity around that variety.
That you've heard of. Okay, thank you. Mr. Frew, Paul?
Yes, okay, and I'll try and be as brief as I can. I want to cover cost, because cost is a massive issue for people connecting to the grid, businesses, renewable energy companies. But there's also time, and time is costly. Can you give us the relationship? And I know it's technical. I'm an electrician by trade, so I know some of the pain that you bear. But can you give us a rule of thumb relationship between the grid strength and then the connection costs, and how that is worked out? Because whilst it is technical, there must be some way that you can work out a rule of thumb formula that will be able to help businesses when they apply or when they even contact you to seek information about applying.
I think we're probably talking about small-scale generation here.
Yes,
Paul,
yeah.
I mean, in terms of a rule of thumb number, the simple message is that having moved from a less congested network in the west to a very congested network in the west has probably introduced a multiplier of between 2 and 3 on the cost. So whereas it was £60,000 or £70,000 18 months ago, it's up near £200,000 on average. So that's what congestion means. To try and help developers understand the likely or potential cost, we have suggested, we did some discussion earlier about providing information, probably website-based initially, which would show the heat map down to the level of the feeder that the individual developer is thinking of connecting into it. We can colour code it, which is tell them whether it's a busy feeder, a medium feeder, or one that's lightly loaded. And that, in conjunction with another rule of thumb factor, which is the distance between him and the nearest primary substation, we feel we should be able to give some fairly broad, but some certainly indications of rule of thumb. Is it going to be less than £100,000? Is it more likely to be £200,000? But it's probably, once you try to go beyond that level of detail, you have to get into quite sophisticated design calculations, and I think we can find a compromise there maybe that allows a wee bit of filtering at the early stages.
I think it's important, sorry Paul, I think it's important that that we don't mislead people as well, so that's the balance, I think.
But surely that, whilst you would argue that you cannot look at every planning application and spend time and man hours on it, surely that would help to target business to areas where there is accessibility and there is potential and the cost can be kept low. So that would eat in or factor into their business plan more, which then would help and assist you in your workload.
Well, and that is largely the reason for doing it. But if I could just, and I don't want to appear conservative for issuing health warnings all the time, but just bear in mind the situation is that when somebody looks at this at a relatively early stage, they could get an indication of something that looks maybe quite attractive to them. And by the time they've gone through a detailed planning, they're ready to get their application in. The game has moved on. Somebody else has moved in ahead of them, and it's not £50,000 anymore. It's twice that. Do you know? So it has to be guarded in a best endeavours, best.
If developers had access to your GIS, your Geographic Information System, surely that would help inform business developers and everyone, and indeed yourself, if you could put some sort of tracking device on it as to applications and people looking at information. Surely that there's something that can be refined within that technology that can help yourselves and businesses. What we're suggesting there, Paul, is that the heat map in conjunction with an overlay of our network, which will show the geographic, the physical layout of the network, we feel there's a combination of information there that could potentially help along the way you're suggesting. We're not of a mind at the minute to make our full GIS records available. There's a number of reasons for doing that, and not least the fact that as we populate our records and we take account of potential connecting parties, there's all sorts of issues around data protection, etc., for other parties on the line. But why then can other companies that are actually in competition with other companies allow access to their systems? Yet NIE, who work alone here, who basically have a monopoly, do not, and guard that information when it should be accessible to the public. Well, I suppose we feel there's a level of information that it's appropriate to share with the public, and we feel would be helpful, but we don't think full access to our records
is appropriate to share. So we possibly take a different view to those other companies.
But then why are those companies then doing that? What's your rationale then for why they do it, but you won't?
One reason may be that in our situation, I would suggest that some of the factors we're dealing here are relatively unique to Northern Ireland in that on the mainland we're aware of companies that simply use the records to determine what's the nearest point of connection, and the price of connection is based on that without any reinforcement being required. And we're quite sure that this is what would happen. In our case, there's a number of, because of the level of congestion on our network, and it is a relatively light network, we know that by placing the full geographic records on the net, it presents information in a way that is potentially going to be quite misleading. Any party who's using that information to do calculations about their connection costs. And we feel that there is a level of that information that it would be appropriate to share, but we don't feel that in our case the full records should be shared.
It has been put to us, and I'll put it to you, that people believe that NIE guard this information because they can charge basically what they want.
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, we've seen some of that coming through in the notes. I suppose all we can say is that in any case that our costs have been challenged, we've been able to explain those costs to the regulator, and we're satisfied that we can do in all cases, and we would we give an outline of the amount of work content when we provide a quotation. There's an indication of the work content that's required. There may not be the level of cost breakdown that all developers would like to see, but there's a pretty solid indication of the amount of work that's required in the connection when we provide the offers, and that has proved acceptable in terms of our statement of charges and our regulatory engagements as well.
One aspect of that if you break that down, one aspect is the half-hour meter, which I think it needs to be the case with the renewable electricity connection. Action Renewables believes NIE's statement of charges is very high, and it states that NIE charges £450 for the purchase and installation of a half-hour meter, which is required. They state that elsewhere it costs £150. How do you counter that?
Well, I suppose all we can say to you is that we haven't looked at that particular challenge in detail, but we do have to go through a rigorous process annually with the regulator to get our statement of charges signed off. We'll be doing another one in the next few months, and all those charges that are finally placed in our statement of charges are ones that we've agreed as reasonable with the utility regulator. If the challenges are being made in those areas, they can be taken account of through that process.
What about the specific the issue of the half-hour meter? If some other company from somewhere else is charging £150, but NIE is charging £450, £450, how can that be justified?
Well, all I can say is that we've been able to justify why we're charging £450 to our regulator, so I can't account to or somebody else in another jurisdiction.
Well, can you justify it to the committee here then? £450.
I don't think we have the. In fairness to Michael, I think we don't have the detailed information on that particular case.
Well,
we're happy to revert on that.
Could you come back to us on that?
Yes,
because,
we can. Yeah.
I don't know whether the regulator goes into that level of detail, but certainly we would want to get it. Certain issues been raised. Well, now, gentlemen, I'm aware that you have to leave to attend the funeral, and it's coming up to 2 minutes to 1 o'clock. So, if whichever two you attend. That's
myself, actually. Yeah.
Please feel free to go. We only had one more question.
No, I'm okay.
Coming here. Are you sure?
Yeah.
I'm happy.
Because I don't want to delay. That's okay, Paul. Sammy, do you want to briefly then?
Sure. Well, I have 4 questions, but 3 of them have been answered. The last one, Paul has asked half of it. So
you want to take the other half?
So it's only a few seconds, I would imagine. It's about the GIS system, and I know. Michael had talked about the reasons why, some of the reasons why you wouldn't let access to developers for a number of reasons. But is it also to do with commercial confidence? And the last part of the question is that if you came to the point where you said, okay, we will actually let you have access to that, would there be a cost to it? Maybe that's a hypothetical question.
No. I mean, when you're talking about commercial confidence now, What do you mean? Do you mean are we confident in our records, or do you mean what?
Well, commercial confidence in that somewhere down the line, some of those people you give the information to may be competing with you.
Yes, now, if I could answer that, that's not really a concern. In fact, now what something we do need to be a little bit careful about is data protection. So we need to make sure that whatever information we're releasing doesn't give a small scale developer out there information about other small scale developers, which would be so. That's something we need to be a little bit careful about. But in terms of the core issue that you've raised there on commercial confidentiality, us versus somebody who might want to get into the connections business, no, that's not really a concern.
If I, and just maybe to tell it, because I do believe that unless the information that is shared is well understood, it has the potential to be very misleading. The GIS records, if they're used in isolation to do calculations, those records will not show reinforcement work that has been attributed to connecting parties who haven't yet connected. But we have had to take account of those parties when we are doing our own design calculations, and that has the potential to completely confuse the situation. And it's just one reason why we need to be very careful about anything that we share.
Okay. Thanks so much. Thank you, Chair. It's me.
One very brief question, and that is, whenever Action Renewables were with us and provided some information to us, they said that the PVs, the solar PVs below, 49 kVs, that wasn't recorded within your system for some reason or other. Can you explain to me why that's the case? Because if that's not been recorded within your system, the cumulative effect of those feeding into the system then won't be showing up as coming from renewable sources. There
has been a legitimate question raised about the way in which that export from those sources is being recorded, and even how it's being traded in the market and the rights of suppliers to buy it or whatever. Now, I think NIE has recognised that with the amount of small-scale solar coming on board, we had been, if you like, using a cruder approximation to what that energy coming onto the network was than is maybe appropriate now. Right. We have taken that on board as an action through what's referred to as a CDA, a design authority that comprises NIE industry members or whatever, and going forward a more precise calculation is now going to be done and available to suppliers and everybody else for the amount of energy that is being contributed. There was a workshop last week that NI hosted specifically on this issue, and a proposal has been brought forward that will shortly be available for sign-off with the regulator.
With a view to implementation from what date?
Well, these things tend to implement within a sort of typically a 2 or 3 month timetable, probably that sort of thing.
Okay.
The ultimate answer to that particular issue is a smart metering solution, and that's some way further down the road.
That's grand. Well, here, I'll not delay any longer because you have to leave. Thanks very much indeed. That was very, very helpful and useful again. And we have a number of questions. If you're grand to accept those in written form and get a written response, please. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, members, and I have another event to go to myself where I'm speaking, actually. So if we could whisk through agenda item number 6, matters raising. There aren't any papers for this item. Agenda item number 7, which is legislation SL1 proposed energy efficiency Northern Ireland Regulation 2014. Just to inform members, the clerk contacted the Consumer Council to check that they had responded to the consultation. They confirmed that they had done and had forwarded their response, and the Consumer Council is in. What have I seen? 1, 2, 3. Oh, we're okay. Is in favour of the proposals. The papers for this item are from page 55 and include cover note page 56, the SL1 page 57, and the Consumer Council response to the consultation page 92. It is subject to a negative resolution, and the proposed date of operation is 5th of June. This is the committee's opportunity to consider the policy set out in SL1, as it isn't possible to amend this once the rule has been made and laid out in the Assembly Business Office. So, if members are content with the policy implication of the proposed legislation. Great?
Great.
Okay. Can I just so very quickly?
Yes, Sam.
And this seems come to this committee late, because it has to go through by the 5th of June. And in the unlikely event of someone saying, I disagree with that, would that cause us major problems because it has to be laid before the 5th of June?
It'll be back to the department then. If there was a major issue,
It's possible that could happen.
Aye.
Just haven't been that situation before. Okay, thank you.
Hopefully there isn't any.
It is, I mean, the SR isn't in the committee office yet, so presumably that timeline will be delayed. However, it is a negative resolution SR, so you know, if the committee weren't in agreement with it, I propose a motion for pray against.
So hopefully that won't happen. Thank you. Now, agenda item number 8 is a written briefing from Detty. This is the June 2014 monitoring round, and the papers are included from excuse me, page 102 onwards, and they include the clerk's brief at page 103, the June monitoring round, page 104, and this information shouldn't be disclosed publicly as it forms part of the DFP Minister's June monitoring deliberations, which will due course be subject to agreement at the Executive and then debate in the Assembly. Now, on standby, should members require further information, are Trevor Cooper, Head of the Finance Division, and Bernie Brankin, Head of Finance Branch. Now, just if I could do a bit of a scoping exercise here, it appears for good reasons that Invest NI are making additional bids for monies there, but if anyone has anything they wish to request or to add about, we would require the officials to come in. Is there anything further that members wish to request? No? Oh, okay, grand then. Thank you. But that's good to see that Invest NI is opening its requests for further support. Agenda item number 9, which is a written briefing from Detty, the website and online presence progress report. Papers for this are on page 127. Okay, it's just more or less a progress update on the briefing that we received previously. So, members agree to note. Yes, great. Agenda item number 10 is a written briefing from Detty, a response to the committee on the consultation on an equality impact assessment for extension of the natural gas network. These papers are included at page 129 and include a consultation of draft equality impact on gas network extension to the west and northwest, page 130. Members happy enough to note?
Great.
Then we move to this will be at page 177, which is correspondence. Jim, do you want to take us through the correspondence there, please? Just.
It shows that the first item is from the Special EU Programmes body in response to the committee's recent request for information on the Connacht carbon neutral combined heat and power plant and balneotherapy project. That's on page 178. It does refer to a report from Invest NI Chair.
They say they don't hold a copy of the report. I think just to finalise our deliberations on this, I think it would be appropriate that we request a copy of this report from Invest NI. So, agree to do that.
Great.
Thank you.
Then Chair from the Financial Conduct Authority regarding its report into IT failures at Ulster Bank. They're unable to share any details of the report at this time due to an ongoing enforcement investigation into RBS. Okay. That's page 128, so if members are content to note that.
Great.
From Assembly Research providing explanatory memorandum with regards to tourism issues. These are things that come from research from time to time just for members' interest. And maybe members would be content to receive those through their members' information email in future unless there are any specific
I think that would be a good issue. Great.
Then from the department on the 2013-2014 provisional outturn. So if members have any comments on that or are content
to note. Great.
Just for members' information on that, in next week's meeting, the PFT commitment outturns for 2013-2014 will be coming to the committee, so there'll be more detail on that at that stage. From stakeholder communications then, on behalf of the Irish News Group, Belfast Telegraph and the newsletter, in regards to a possible future oral briefing that they would like to have with the committee on the importance of the print industry to Northern Ireland.
I think we have an opportunity on the 19th of June, have we, Jim?
We have, Chair.
Agreed to that. We agree to that.
Great.
Okay, agreed. Thank you.
From the Minister of Culture, Arts and Leisure, including a copy of the legacy report for the 2013 Workplace and Fire Games, which the committee had requested when it was finalised. That's on page 187. A full report is in the committee office if members want to review it.
Okay, great.
Then for the Committee for Agriculture and Rural Development, including copy of the report by LOC Food Project. Also included in members' pack at page 211 is a draft response to the Committee for Agriculture and Rural Development. So if members are content to agree
with the response. Agreed.
Great.
Thank you.
And then an invitation to the launch of the forthcoming book, Campaign Canvas and Cavalcade, written by Irish News political correspondent John Manley, to be held in room 115 on Thursday, the 12th of June. And the event is being sponsored by the Chair of the Committee.
Okay.
You should know a lot about that, Chair.
Well, a wee bit, but...
The last few weeks.
Indeed. I think maybe it's a different type of campaigning, but...
But just for members to know that that's the date the members are in, the committee's in Invest NI that date, so members will be coming back from Invest NI, but the committee office will be in touch to see if members are available to attend.
Okay, grand.
Then from Full Circle, providing an introductory brochure to Full Circle Power Energy Park. So the brochure will be held in the committee office if members wish to look at it.
I think members will... I know I got this anyway. I think it came out...
It was sent out to us.
Through the week there, so...
Yeah, we got one, thanks.
Might be useful sometime to go and have a look at that from the committee, just that power issue. So can we...
Add it to future items?
Please. Okay. And just to be notified the firm that that's what our intention is. Thank you. Right, Jim.
Then from the Committee for Finance and Personnel regarding correspondence they received from a member of the public who had experienced a delay in the Department responding to information they requested under FOA in relation to Presbyterian Mutual Society. That's page 215.
Yes, see, some of this has run on from 9th of December last. So members agreed that we get an update from the department as to why the delays.
Great.
Okay.
And Chair, are you content to respond to the individual then, stating this has been done?
Okay, agreed then.
And then from the Payments Council, providing an update on the current account switch service. That's at page 223.
Okay, we've got the details of that. Okay, thanks for that, Jim. And then agenda item number 12 is an updated draft forward work programme. Members content with that? Okay. Yeah. Any other business? No?
Chairman, just a quick update on the San Diego. Is everything going according to plan?
Or whoever's organising.
Whoever it is, San Diego.
Yes, certainly. There's a lot of organisation involved in it with A2 visas and that sort of thing. But yes, things are going well, and we've been in touch with the Northern Ireland Bureau and are organising additional meetings in both San Diego and San Francisco.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
There we are. Okay, thanks very much for that, everybody. Date, time and place next meeting next Thursday, 5th of June, in room 30 at 10 a.m. Okay, thank you.
Committee room 30.